So, Cartman's dad is literally his mom, just his mom, not in a metaphorical way. The show spent an entire 2-part episode building up this mystery, only to reveal the most absurd answer possible, and then pretend it never happened. Then 10 seasons later, they completely change the answer to make it even darker. This is South Park treating continuity like a weapon instead of a responsibility. The whole thing starts in season 1 with Cartman's mom is a dirty slut. The episode sets up this big mystery about who Cartman's father is, and the answer is supposed to be revealed in part 2. They show all these potential candidates: Chef, Mr. Garrison, Officer Barbrady, Jimbo, Ned, the entire 1989 Denver Broncos. Leanne Cartman apparently slept with everyone in town, and the paternity test results are coming. The episode ends on a genuine cliffhanger, April 1st, 1998. Everyone tunes in for the answer, and Comedy Central airs Terrence and Phillip in Not Without My Anus instead. Think about how genius and cruel this is. Millions of people waited a month to find out who Cartman's father is, and instead they get a full episode about 2 Canadian fart comedians that the show itself constantly makes fun of as lowbrow entertainment. No South Park kids, no Cartman, no reveal. Just Terrence and Phillip farting and saying Buddy and Guy for 22 minutes while stopping a terrorist plot. The audience lost their minds. People were calling Comedy Central to complain. Message boards exploded. This was before social media, so people had to actually organize their outrage through slower channels. South Park had pulled off the most elaborate April Fool's prank in television history by literally not airing the episode people wanted to see. But here's where it gets really interesting. When they finally aired the actual Part 2 episode a week later, the answer was completely absurd. Dr. Mephisto reveals that Cartman's mother is also his father. Leanne Cartman is hermaphroditic. She has both sets of reproductive organs, which means she got herself pregnant somehow. The father is the mother. Case closed. This should be impossible biologically, even in South Park's universe where absurd things happen constantly. But the show treats it like a legitimate medical reveal. Dr. Mephisto explains it with scientific terminology. Chef accepts it. Everyone moves on like this makes perfect sense, and then the show basically never mentions it again. What makes this so fascinating is how the episode treats the audience. South Park made everyone wait through an elaborate prank episode, then gave them an answer that's essentially a middle finger disguised as a plot twist. You wanted to know who the father is? The mother is the father. Happy now? The April Fool's setup reveals something important about South Park's relationship with its viewers. The show is willing to destroy goodwill and break narrative promises if it means executing a joke. They don't care if you're invested in the mystery. They care if the prank works, and the prank only works if you're genuinely invested, which means they have to betray that investment to make the joke land. Think about what this means for storytelling. Most shows try to reward viewer loyalty by delivering satisfying payoffs. South Park rewards viewer loyalty by mocking the very concept of satisfying payoffs. You were emotionally invested in Cartman's paternity? That's your problem, not theirs. The hermaphrodite reveal is also South Park's way of commenting on television's obsession with mysteries and cliffhangers. Shows like Dallas and Twin Peaks had trained audiences to expect big dramatic reveals after season-ending cliffhangers. South Park looked at that formula and decided to explode it from the inside. They built the mystery, executed the cliffhanger perfectly, then gave an answer so ridiculous it retroactively makes the entire mystery feel pointless. But the story doesn't end there, because 10 seasons later, in the episode 201, South Park completely retcons the entire paternity situation. Turns out Leanne isn't really hermaphroditic at all. That was a lie told to protect the real father. The actual father is Jack Tenorman, the farmer that Cartman had killed and fed, to his own son, Scott Tenorman, in the episode Scott Tenorman Must Die. This means Cartman orchestrated his own half-brother eating their shared father. Let that sink in for a second. Cartman didn't just commit patricide, he committed it without knowing it, then tricked his half-brother into cannibalism, then revealed what he'd done in the most psychologically devastating way possible, all while having no idea he was destroying his own family. The retcon transforms Scott Tenorman Must Die from a dark comedy episode into something approaching Greek tragedy. Cartman is so obsessed with getting revenge on a kid who scammed him out of $16 that he murders his own father and feeds him to his brother. The episode that fans consider one of the greatest South Park episodes ever made gets even darker in retrospect. What makes this retcon particularly brutal is how it recontextualizes Cartman's character. He's not just a bratty kid who occasionally does terrible things. He's someone who committed patricide and fratricide by proxy before hitting puberty, and he can never know the full weight of what he's done because revealing it would destroy him psychologically. The show hints at this in 201 when Mitch Connor tells Cartman the truth about his father. Cartman breaks down crying, not because he feels guilty about killing Jack Tenorman, but because learning his father was a Denver Bronco who died before he could meet him is too much to handle. He wanted his father to be someone important. Finding out he killed his own father would be worse than never knowing at all. This is where South Park reveals something really dark about Cartman's psychology. His entire personality is built on compensation for not having a father figure. He's desperate for authority and recognition because he grew up without paternal validation. Learning that he had a father and murdered him would shatter his sense of self completely. But here's the thing about the double reveal. It also recontextualizes the original hermaphrodite answer. Was Dr. Mephisto lying in the season 1 finale? Was he in on the conspiracy to protect Jack Tenorman's identity? Or did South Park genuinely give a joke answer in season 1 and then later decided to create real continuity by retroactively making it a cover-up? The genius is that both interpretations work. If Mephisto was lying, then South Park planted the seeds for long-term storytelling while appearing to blow up continuity. If they really did just change their minds 10 seasons later, then they successfully weaponized their own inconsistency by making it feel intentional. Either way, the message is clear. South Park will absolutely change fundamental character facts years later if it makes a better joke or creates darker implications. Continuity exists to be exploited, not respected. The 201 retcon also makes Leanne Cartman's character make more sense in retrospect. She's not actually hermaphroditic, which means her sexual history with the entire town was genuine promiscuity rather than biological confusion. She really did sleep with everyone, and she's been protecting Cartman from the truth about his father his entire life. That's why she never pushes back on his behavior. She knows what he's capable of because he inherited it from Jack Tenorman. Think about how messed up this family dynamic is. Leanne knows Cartman killed his father and fed him to Scott. She can't tell him because it would destroy him. She can't tell Scott because he's already traumatized. She has to live with this knowledge while raising a sociopath who occasionally shows her genuine affection between demanding whatever he wants and threatening her when she refuses. The Tenorman connection also explains why Cartman is so much worse than the other kids. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny all have fathers who are present in their lives, even if those fathers are flawed. Cartman has a vacuum where paternal authority should be, which he fills with authoritarian fantasies and desperate attempts to control everyone around him. He's not just bratty. He's compensating for fundamental developmental damage. What makes the paternity saga so representative of South Park's approach is how it treats audience expectations. Most shows would build a mystery, reveal the answer, and move on. South Park builds a mystery, pranks the audience, gives a joke answer, ignores it for 10 years, then retroactively makes it part of a much darker storyline. The inconsistency becomes the point. This approach only works because South Park has trained its audience to expect nothing and everything simultaneously. You can't predict what they'll do because they've shown they're willing to contradict themselves, retcon major plot points, and weaponize their own history. The paternity mystery proves that nothing is sacred, not even the truth about a character's fundamental identity. The really twisted part is how the show handles Cartman's ignorance about his patricide. He can never know what he did because knowing would either destroy him or make him worse. If it destroyed him, the show loses its most dynamic character. If it made him worse, he'd cross lines even South Park won't cross. So Cartman exists in permanent ignorance of his greatest crime, which is somehow crueler than if he knew and didn't care. Scott Tenorman's character gets completely transformed by the retcon too. He's not just a kid who got revenge murdered by a psycho younger kid. He's Cartman's half-brother who got tricked into eating their shared father. The episode where Scott appears in therapy, broken and institutionalized, becomes even sadder when you know he's dealing with fratricide trauma on top of the cannibalism. The show never explicitly confirms whether Scott knows Cartman is his half-brother. The reveal in 201 happens to Cartman, but we don't see Scott's reaction. This ambiguity makes the relationship even more disturbing. If Scott knows, then every interaction with Cartman carries the weight of fratricide. If he doesn't know, then he's being denied the truth about his own family just like Cartman is. What makes this storytelling approach so distinctive is how it weaponizes time. Most retcons feel cheap because they contradict established facts. South Park's retcon feels earned because it was always plausible that the hermaphrodite reveal was a lie. The show built in just enough ambiguity that changing the answer 10 years later feels like revealing hidden truth rather than inventing new facts. The paternity saga also reveals South Park's attitude toward television as a medium. They're not trying to build a consistent fictional universe that viewers can trust and invest in. They're treating television as a space for meta-commentary about television itself. The April Fool's prank is commentary on cliffhangers. The joke answer is commentary on unsatisfying reveals. The retcon is commentary on how shows handle continuity. Every layer is about the medium as much as the story. This is what separates South Park from shows that just break their own rules randomly. The inconsistency isn't lazy writing. It's deliberate provocation. They're testing how much they can change fundamental facts while maintaining viewer investment. And the answer is that they can change everything as long as the new version is more interesting than the old version. The hermaphrodite reveal wasn't interesting beyond the initial shock, but the Jack Tenorman reveal is infinitely more interesting because it adds tragic weight to Cartman's character while making Scott Tenorman must die even darker in retrospect. The retcon improves the show's mythology by creating depth where there was only a joke before. But here's the kicker. Even after the 201 reveal, the show mostly ignores Cartman's paternity again. It comes up occasionally in later episodes, but it's not treated as this huge character-defining revelation. Cartman goes back to being Cartman. The show refuses to let even its darkest revelations become permanent character development. Everything can be reset if the next episode needs it to be. This is South Park's ultimate statement about continuity and storytelling. Even the darkest truths about characters are ultimately just tools for jokes and commentary. Nothing is so sacred that it can't be ignored when convenient. The paternity reveal matters when it matters and doesn't matter when it doesn't matter. That's not inconsistency. That's radical flexibility disguised as chaos. The Cartman paternity saga shows us that South Park treats its own mythology like a toy box. They'll build elaborate backstories and dark revelations, but only when it serves the immediate needs of whatever joke or commentary they're making. The rest of the time, those revelations sit in the background, occasionally referenced but never truly integrated into the show's ongoing narrative. What this creates is a show where anything can be true and nothing has to be true. Cartman killed his father and doesn't know it. That's canon. But it only matters when the show decides it matters. The rest of the time, he's just a bratty kid with a pushover mom and an absent father. Both versions exist simultaneously depending on what the episode needs. Now, let's move on to Kenny's death cycle and the cult of Cthulhu. Word count target, 3,800 words. So Cartman's dad is literally his mom. Just his mom. Not in a metaphorical way. The show spent an entire 2-part episode building up this mystery, only to reveal the most absurd answer possible, and then pretend it never happened. Then 10 seasons later, they completely changed the answer to make it even darker. This is South Park, treating continuity like a weapon instead of a responsibility. The whole thing starts in Season 1 with Cartman's mom is a dirty slut. The episode sets up this big mystery about who Cartman's father is, and the answer is supposed to be revealed in part 2. They show all these potential candidates: Chef, Mr. Garrison, Officer Barbrady, Jimbo, Ned, the entire 1989 Denver Broncos. Leanne Cartman apparently slept with everyone in town, and the paternity test results are coming. The episode ends on a genuine cliffhanger. April 1st, 1998. Everyone tunes in for the answer. And Comedy Central airs Terrence and Philip in Not Without My Anus instead. Think about how genius and cruel this is. Millions of people waited a month to find out who Cartman's father is, and instead they get a full episode about two Canadian fart comedians that the show itself constantly makes fun of as lowbrow entertainment. No South Park kids, no Cartman, no reveal. Just Terrence and Philip farting and saying "Buddy and Guy" for 22 minutes while stopping a terrorist plot. The audience lost their minds. People were calling Comedy Central to complain. Message boards exploded. This was before social media, so people had to actually organize their outrage through slower channels. South Park had pulled off the most elaborate April Fool's prank in television history by literally not airing the episode people wanted to see. The brilliance of using Terrence and Philip specifically cannot be overstated. These characters exist within South Park as a show within a show that adults constantly criticize as stupid and lowbrow. The kids love it. The parents hate it. It's South Park's meta-commentary on how people view South Park itself. So by replacing the Cartman reveal with Terrence and Philip, the show is essentially saying, you think we're stupid lowbrow comedy? Here's an entire episode of actual stupid lowbrow comedy. Happy now? The Terrence and Philip episode is actually well crafted in its own right. It parodies political thrillers and hostage situations while maintaining the fart joke aesthetic that defines those characters. But nobody wanted to appreciate its craftsmanship. They wanted Cartman's father. The show forced them to watch something else entirely, knowing full well it would infuriate everyone. That's not just trolling. That's performance art disguised as trolling. But here's where it gets really interesting. When they finally aired the actual Part 2 episode a week later, the answer was completely absurd. Dr. Mephisto reveals that Cartman's mother is also his father. Leanne Cartman is hermaphroditic. She has both sets of reproductive organs, which means she got herself pregnant somehow. The father is the mother. Case closed. This should be impossible biologically, even in South Park's universe, where absurd things happen constantly. But the show treats it like a legitimate medical reveal. Dr. Mephisto explains it with scientific terminology. Chef accepts it. Everyone moves on like this makes perfect sense. And then the show basically never mentions it again. What makes this so fascinating is how the episode treats the audience. South Park made everyone wait through an elaborate prank episode, then gave them an answer that's essentially a middle finger disguised as a plot twist. You wanted to know who the father is? The mother is the father. Happy now? The answer also works as commentary on the mystery itself. The show built up this paternity question as something important and meaningful. Every character in town could be Cartman's father. The revelation should tell us something fundamental about Cartman's identity and explain why he's the way he is. Instead, the answer is biological nonsense that explains nothing and raises more questions than it answers. It's the show admitting that Cartman's father doesn't actually matter to the story they're telling. The April Fool's setup reveals something important about South Park's relationship with its viewers. The show is willing to destroy goodwill and break narrative promises if it means executing a joke. They don't care if you're invested in the mystery. They care if the prank works, and the prank only works if you're genuinely invested, which means they have to betray that investment to make the joke land. Think about what this means for storytelling. Most shows try to reward viewer loyalty by delivering satisfying payoffs. South Park rewards viewer loyalty by mocking the very concept of satisfying payoffs. You were emotionally invested in Cartman's paternity? That's your problem, not theirs. The hermaphrodite reveal is also South Park's way of commenting on television's obsession with mysteries and cliffhangers. Shows like Dallas and Twin Peaks had trained audiences to expect big dramatic reveals after season-ending cliffhangers. South Park looked at that formula and decided to explode it from the inside. They built the mystery, executed the cliffhanger perfectly, then gave an answer so ridiculous it retroactively makes the entire mystery feel pointless. Comedy Central's role in this prank deserves examination too. The network had to approve airing Terrence and Philip instead of the promised resolution. They knew viewers would be furious. They knew advertisers might complain. But they went along with it anyway because the prank was too perfect to pass up. This shows how much creative control South Park had even in its first season. Most shows can't tell their network to deliberately anger their audience. South Park made it a tradition. The viewer outrage became part of the show's mythology. Parker and Stone talk about the angry phone calls in interviews. The prank elevated South Park from controversial cartoon to cultural phenomenon. People who'd never watched the show heard about the April Fool's episode and tuned in to see what the fuss was about. The betrayal of audience trust became the show's most effective marketing campaign. But the story doesn't end there, because 10 seasons later, in the episode 201, South Park completely retcons the entire paternity situation. Turns out Liane isn't really hermaphroditic at all. That was a lie told to protect the real father. The actual father is Jack Tenorman, the farmer that Cartman had killed and fed to his own son Scott Tenorman in the episode Scott Tenorman Must Die. This means Cartman orchestrated his own half-brother eating their shared father. Let that sink in for a second. Cartman didn't just commit patricide. He committed it without knowing it, then tricked his half-brother into cannibalism, then revealed what he'd done in the most psychologically devastating way possible, all while having no idea he was destroying his own family. The retcon transformed Scott Tenorman Must Die from a dark comedy episode into something approaching Greek tragedy. Cartman is so obsessed with getting revenge on a kid who scammed him out of $16 that he murders his own father and feeds him to his brother, the episode that fans consider one of the greatest South Park episodes ever made gets even darker in retrospect. Scott Tenorman Must Die originally worked as a turning point for Cartman's character. Before that episode, Cartman was just a bratty kid who occasionally did mean things. After that episode, he became genuinely terrifying. The chilly reveal showed that Cartman is capable of premeditated psychological torture that would make adult sociopaths uncomfortable. He doesn't just want to win. He wants to destroy people so completely that they can never recover. The episode's most famous scene has Cartman watching Scott cry while licking his tears and calling them unfathomably delicious. It's played for comedy, and it is funny in a horrible way, but it's also genuinely disturbing because you're watching a child experience sadistic pleasure from another child's trauma. The fact that he's eating his own father's remains while doing this adds a layer of cosmic horror that the original episode couldn't access because the paternity connection hadn't been established yet. What makes this retcon particularly brutal is how it recontextualizes Cartman's character. He's not just a bratty kid who occasionally does terrible things. He's someone who committed patricide and fratricide by proxy before hitting puberty, and he can never know the full weight of what he's done because revealing it would destroy him psychologically. The show hints at this in 201 when Mitch Connor tells Cartman the truth about his father. Cartman breaks down crying, not because he feels guilty about killing Jack Tenorman, but because learning his father was a Denver Bronco who died before he could meet him is too much to handle. He wanted his father to be someone important. Finding out he killed his own father would be worse than never knowing at all. This is where South Park reveals something really dark about Cartman's psychology. His entire personality is built on compensation for not having a father figure. He's desperate for authority and recognition because he grew up without paternal validation. Learning that he had a father and murdered him would shatter his sense of self completely. Cartman's obsession with authority makes sense through this lens. He constantly tries to become a cop, a prison guard, a dictator, anything that gives him institutional power over others. He craves the structure and validation that a father typically provides. Without that foundation, he builds his own authority through manipulation and force. He becomes the father figure he never had, except twisted into something authoritarian and cruel. His relationship with Kyle also gains new dimensions when viewed through the paternity lens. Kyle has a stable two-parent household with a father who's present and engaged. Cartman targets Kyle specifically and relentlessly, often in ways that seem to exceed the boundaries of their rivalry. Maybe Cartman recognizes something in Kyle that he lacks. Maybe destroying Kyle is about destroying the evidence that stable families produce better adjusted children. If Cartman can't have a father, he'll make sure Kyle's father doesn't matter either. But here's the thing about the double reveal. It also recontextualizes the original hermaphrodite answer. Was Dr. Mephisto lying in the Season 1 finale? Was he in on the conspiracy to protect Jack Tennerman's identity? Or did South Park genuinely give a joke answer in Season 1 and then later decided to create real continuity by retroactively making it a cover-up? The genius is that both interpretations work. If Mephisto was lying, then South Park planted the seeds for long-term storytelling while appearing to blow up continuity. If they really did just change their minds 10 seasons later, then they successfully weaponized their own inconsistency by making it feel intentional. Dr. Mephisto's character makes more sense as a conspirator than as someone who genuinely believed the hermaphrodite explanation. He's a mad scientist who creates genetic experiments. He understands biology better than anyone in South Park. The idea that he would misread a paternity test so badly that he concluded Leanne impregnated herself strains credibility, even for South Park. It's more likely he was paid or threatened to provide a false result that would protect Jack Tennerman's reputation. The conspiracy extends beyond just Dr. Mephisto, too. The entire town seems to know Leanne's sexual history. Everyone participated in the paternity test, but nobody questioned the hermaphrodite result. Nobody asked for a second opinion. The collective acceptance of an impossible answer suggests the town was complicit in the cover-up. Maybe they all knew Jack Tennerman was the father but agreed to protect him. Maybe South Park operates on an unspoken code where certain truths are too destructive to acknowledge publicly. Either way, the message is clear. South Park will absolutely change fundamental character facts years later if it makes a better joke or creates darker implications. Continuity exists to be exploited, not respected. The 201 retcon also makes Leanne Cartman's character make more sense in retrospect. She's not actually hermaphroditic, which means her sexual history with the entire town was genuine promiscuity rather than biological confusion. She really did sleep with everyone, and she's been protecting Cartman from the truth about his father his entire life. That's why she never pushes back on his behavior. She knows what he's capable of because he inherited it from Jack Tennerman. Leanne's passivity toward Cartman's increasingly sociopathic behavior reads differently when you know she's protecting him from a truth that would destroy him. Every time she gives in to his demands, she's making a calculation. Is fighting with him about this worth the risk that he'll dig deeper into his paternity? Is disciplining him worth potentially triggering a breakdown that leads to the truth? She's not a pushover. She's a mother engaging in damage control 24 hours a day. Think about how messed up this family dynamic is. Leanne knows Cartman killed his father and fed him to Scott. She can't tell him because it would destroy him. She can't tell Scott because he's already traumatized. She has to live with this knowledge while raising a sociopath who occasionally shows her genuine affection between demanding whatever he wants and threatening her when she refuses. The few moments where Leanne does stand up to Cartman gain new weight with this context when she finally puts her foot down in Tust and hires the dog whisperer to fix his behavior. It's not just about discipline, it's about preventing the monster she created from destroying himself. When Cartman breaks her and she goes back to enabling him, it's not weakness. It's acceptance that she's lost the ability to control the situation she's trapped in. The Tennerman connection also explains why Cartman is so much worse than the other kids. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny all have fathers who are present in their lives, even if those fathers are flawed. Cartman has a vacuum where paternal authority should be, which he fills with authoritarian fantasies and desperate attempts to control everyone around him. He's not just bratty, he's compensating for fundamental developmental damage. What makes the paternity saga so representative of South Park's approach is how it treats audience expectations. Most shows would build a mystery, reveal the answer, and move on. South Park builds a mystery, pranks the audience, gives a joke answer, ignores it for 10 years, then retroactively makes it part of a much darker storyline. The inconsistency becomes the point. This approach only works because South Park has trained its audience to expect nothing and everything simultaneously. You can't predict what they'll do because they've shown they're willing to contradict themselves, retcon major plot points, and weaponize their own history. The paternity mystery proves that nothing is sacred, not even the truth about a character's fundamental identity. The really twisted part is how the show handles Cartman's ignorance about his patricide. He can never know what he did because knowing would either destroy him or make him worse. If it destroyed him, the show loses its most dynamic character. If it made him worse, he'd cross lines even South Park won't cross. So Cartman exists in permanent ignorance of his greatest crime, which is somehow crueler than if he knew and didn't care. The psychological implications of unconscious patricide are staggering. Cartman walks around every day having committed one of humanity's oldest taboos without awareness. His subconscious might know. His dreams might contain clues, but his conscious mind protects itself by keeping the truth locked away. He's simultaneously guilty and innocent, which is the most unstable psychological position possible. Scott Tenorman's character gets completely transformed by the retcon too. He's not just a kid who got revenge murdered by a psycho younger kid. He's Cartman's half-brother who got tricked into eating their shared father. The episode where Scott appears in therapy, broken and institutionalized, becomes even sadder when you know he's dealing with fratricide trauma on top of the cannibalism. The show never explicitly confirms whether Scott knows Cartman is his half-brother. The reveal in 201 happens to Cartman, but we don't see Scott's reaction. This ambiguity makes the relationship even more disturbing. If Scott knows, then every interaction with Cartman carries the weight of fratricide. If he doesn't know, then he's being denied the truth about his own family, just like Cartman is. Imagine being Scott Tenorman and learning this information. The kid who tortured you psychologically is your half-brother. The father he fed you was your shared father. Your entire trauma is actually a family tragedy, orchestrated by someone who shares your DNA. That information doesn't make the trauma better. It makes it exponentially worse, because now it's not just what happened, it's who did it and why it matters on a deeper level. What makes this storytelling approach so distinctive is how it weaponizes time. Most retcons feel cheap because they contradict established facts. South Park's retcon feels earned because it was always plausible that the hermaphrodite reveal was a lie. The show built in just enough ambiguity that changing the answer 10 years later feels like revealing hidden truth rather than inventing new facts. The paternity saga also reveals South Park's attitude toward television as a medium. They're not trying to build a consistent fictional universe that viewers can trust and invest in. They're treating television as a space for meta-commentary about television itself. The April Fool's prank is commentary on cliffhangers. The joke answer is commentary on unsatisfying reveals. The retcon is commentary on how shows handle continuity. Every layer is about the medium as much as the story. This is what separates South Park from shows that just break their own rules randomly. The inconsistency isn't lazy writing, it's deliberate provocation. They're testing how much they can change fundamental facts while maintaining viewer investment, and the answer is that they can change everything as long as the new version is more interesting than the old version. The hermaphrodite reveal wasn't interesting beyond the initial shock, but the Jack Tenorman reveal is infinitely more interesting because it adds tragic weight to Cartman's character while making Scott Tenorman must die even darker in retrospect. The retcon improves the show's mythology by creating depth where there was only a joke before. But here's the kicker. Even after the 201 reveal, the show mostly ignores Cartman's paternity again. It comes up occasionally in later episodes, but it's not treated as this huge character-defining revelation. Cartman goes back to being Cartman. The show refuses to let even its darkest revelations become permanent character development. Everything can be reset if the next episode needs it to be. This is South Park's ultimate statement about continuity and storytelling. Even the darkest truths about characters are ultimately just tools for jokes and commentary. Nothing is so sacred that it can't be ignored when convenient. The paternity reveal matters when it matters and doesn't matter when it doesn't matter. That's not inconsistency. That's radical flexibility disguised as chaos. The Cartman paternity saga shows us that South Park treats its own mythology like a toy box. They'll build elaborate backstories and dark revelations, but only when it serves the immediate needs of whatever joke or commentary they're making. The rest of the time, those revelations sit in the background, occasionally referenced but never truly integrated into the show's ongoing narrative. What this creates is a show where anything can be true and nothing has to be true. Cartman killed his father and doesn't know it. That's canon. But it only matters when the show decides it matters. The rest of the time, he's just a bratty kid with a pushover mom and an absent father. Both versions exist simultaneously depending on what the episode needs. The audience has learned to accept this fluidity because South Park rewards it with better storytelling. The joke answer was funny for one episode. The real answer provides years of psychological depth and tragic irony. By waiting 10 years to reveal the truth, the show let Scott Tenorman Must Die become a legendary episode on its own merits. Then they enhanced its legacy by adding a layer that makes it even more disturbing. That's not disrespecting continuity, that's playing the long game with continuity as a weapon. Now let's move on to Kenny's death cycle and the cult of Cthulhu. Kenny McCormick dies in almost every episode, comes back the next day, and nobody questions it. But when you actually look at the Cthulhu episodes and the Mysterian trilogy, you realize Kenny is trapped in an eternal death loop that he's completely aware of, and it's destroying his sanity. His friends forget he existed every single time he dies. His parents know about the curse but won't break it because they're too devoted to the Cthulhu cult that caused it. Kenny is living every child's nightmare of being invisible and forgotten, except it's literal and happens dozens of times a year. The early seasons treat Kenny's deaths as pure comedy. He gets crushed, impaled, electrocuted, eaten, exploded, and worse. The other kids say, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny, and you bastards," like it's a catchphrase. Then the next episode starts and Kenny's back without explanation. For years, this was just the show's running gag. The deaths themselves are often elaborate and creative. Kenny gets crushed by a falling mirror space station. He gets impaled on a flagpole. He gets his face ripped off by turkeys. The show treats mortality as an opportunity for increasingly absurd death sequences. Each death tries to outdo the previous one in terms of graphic violence and unexpected circumstances. It's slapstick taken to its logical extreme, where the victim never actually stays dead. But there's always been something uncomfortable about the Kenny deaths, if you think about them too long. The other kids watch their friend die horribly, express minimal grief, and move on with their day. They'll literally step over his corpse to continue whatever they were doing before he died. The emotional detachment suggests something deeply wrong with how these kids process death, or how death works in their world, or both. Then Mysterian Rise is aired and everything changed. The episode reveals that Kenny has a secret identity as Mysterian, a Batman-style vigilante trying to fight crime in South Park. He's been Mysterian for a while, but nobody knows who's under the mask. When Cartman starts his Coon superhero franchise and demands everyone join his team, Mysterian refuses to work under Cartman's authority. This creates a power struggle that eventually forces Mysterian to reveal his identity. Kenny pulls off his mask in front of everyone and expects shock and recognition. Instead, his friends don't remember that he dies constantly. They have no idea why Kenny being Mysterian is significant. This is when Kenny breaks down and explains the truth. He remembers every single death, every crushing, every impalement, every explosion. He wakes up in his bed the next morning in his same orange parka, and nobody remembers what happened. His parents act like nothing occurred. His friends have no memory of him dying the day before. Kyle and Stan, his supposed best friends, don't even remember that he missed school because he was dead. The scene where Kenny explains this is played completely straight. His voice, usually muffled and incomprehensible, comes through clearly. He's not joking or exaggerating. He's genuinely disturbed by his situation in a way that transcends South Park's usual cynicism. The other kids don't believe him at first because, from their perspective, Kenny is making an insane claim about dying repeatedly and resurrecting. Think about what this means for Kenny's psychology. He's experienced violent death dozens, maybe hundreds of times by age 9. Each death is painful and terrifying, and then he wakes up knowing it will happen again soon, probably in some horrible way he can't predict or prevent. He's trapped in an infinite loop of trauma that nobody else can perceive or help him escape. The show plays this revelation completely straight. Kenny isn't joking or exaggerating. His voice cracks when he describes waking up in his bed after dying. He's genuinely disturbed by his situation in a way that transcends South Park's usual cynicism. For once, the show drops the ironic distance and lets a character's pain be real. Kenny's awareness of his deaths transforms him from comic relief into the most tragic character in the show. Every morning he wakes up knowing that death is coming. He can't prevent it. He can't escape it. He can only wait for it to arrive and hope it's quick. That's not living. That's serving a life sentence where the execution date is unknown but guaranteed. The psychological toll of repeated death experiences would destroy most adults. Kenny is experiencing this as a child, when his brain is still developing and his understanding of mortality is forming. His concept of death is completely different from normal humans because, for him, death is temporary but unavoidable. He knows what happens when you die because he's done it repeatedly, but he also knows it doesn't stick, which creates this strange relationship with mortality where he fears it and dismisses it simultaneously. But here's where it gets even darker. Kenny's parents know about the curse. They're members of a Cthulhu death cult that meets regularly to worship an ancient god. At one of these meetings, Kenny's dad, Stuart, explains that they attended a cult meeting years ago and agreed to certain terms to get free beer. Those terms apparently included cursing their unborn son with immortality. They chose free beer over their child's mortal soul. The casual way Stuart explains this reveals how the McCormicks think. They don't see long-term consequences. They see immediate gratification. Free beer at a cult meeting sounds great until you realize you've condemned your unborn child to eternal torment. But even after Kenny's born and they see what the curse is doing to him, they keep attending cult meetings. They keep worshiping Cthulhu. They keep participating in the system that tortured their son. This raises questions about whether the curse can even be broken. Maybe the McCormicks tried to undo it and failed. Maybe they're too afraid of Cthulhu to try. Or maybe they genuinely don't think the curse is that bad, because they don't remember Kenny's deaths either. The memory wipe might protect them from guilt by making them forget they have anything to feel guilty about. And they keep attending the cult meetings even after Kenny's born, even after they see what the curse is doing to him. The show reveals this casually, like it's just another example of the McCormicks being terrible parents. But the implications are horrifying. Kenny's parents condemned him to eternal death and rebirth for alcohol. They had a choice and chose wrong, and Kenny suffers forever because of their decision. Stuart McCormick is arguably more culpable than Leanne Cartman in the terrible parent competition. Leanne enables Cartman's sociopathy, but she didn't curse him with supernatural torment. Stuart literally sold his son's soul for beer and continues participating in the cult that maintains the curse. Every meeting he attends is a choice to prioritize cult membership over his son's well-being. What makes Kenny's situation worse than regular immortality is the forgetting. If people remembered his deaths, he could at least process the trauma with others. His friends could comfort him. His teachers could get him therapy. His parents might feel guilty enough to try breaking the curse. But the curse includes a memory wipe for everyone except Kenny himself. He's isolated inside his own trauma with no way to share or escape it. The memory wipe also explains the catchphrase, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny. You bastards" functions as a brief moment of awareness that immediately dissolves. The kids react to Kenny's death in the moment, but the memory doesn't stick. It's like their brains are trying to hold on to the information, but the curse actively deletes it. The catchphrase is muscle memory, words their mouths form without their minds understanding why. This creates a horrifying dynamic where Kenny experiences community for about 5 seconds after each death, then loses it completely. His friends acknowledge his death, express grief, and then forget he ever existed. He gets a taste of being mourned before being erased. That's crueler than if they never reacted at all, because it proves they're capable of caring. They just can't retain the caring long enough for it to matter. The Coon trilogy expands on this by showing Kenny team up with Cthulhu itself. When Cartman betrays Coon and friends and forms an alliance with the Dark God, Kenny sees an opportunity. If Cthulhu gave him this curse, maybe Cthulhu can take it away. He spends multiple episodes trying to communicate with this cosmic horror entity, hoping to negotiate his way out of eternal resurrection. Cthulhu doesn't care. Or maybe Cthulhu does care, but enjoys Kenny's suffering. Either way, the curse continues. Kenny remains trapped. His one chance at escaping his fate by appealing to the source of his curse leads nowhere. Even cosmic intervention can't save him, because the cosmic entities are the ones who cursed him. The image of Kenny riding Cthulhu is both ridiculous and profound. He's this tiny orange-parked child sitting on top of an ancient god of chaos and destruction. For a brief moment, Kenny has power over the entity that controls his fate. But it's illusory power. Cthulhu tolerates Kenny's presence but doesn't actually grant him agency or freedom. Kenny gets to feel important while remaining completely trapped by forces beyond his control. The really messed up part is how this changes the audience's relationship with Kenny's deaths. For the first 100 episodes, it was funny watching Kenny die in creative ways. He was barely a character beyond the deaths and muffled voice, but once you know he experiences every death consciously and wakes up remembering them all, the comedy curdles into something much darker. Every time Kenny gets crushed by a falling object, that's a child experiencing the sensation of his bones breaking and organs rupturing. Every time he burns to death, he feels the fire consuming his flesh. Every time he bleeds out, he experiences the slow drain of life leaving his body. And then he wakes up and goes to school like nothing happened because nobody will believe him if he talks about it. The show doesn't stop killing Kenny after the Mysterian reveal. If anything, his deaths become more frequent and elaborate in later seasons. Now we watch them knowing Kenny experiences every second of agony. The joke has context that transforms it from slapstick into horror. We're laughing at a child's repeated traumatic deaths with full awareness that he feels everything. That makes us complicit in his suffering. Stan and Kyle's catchphrase becomes even more disturbing in this context. They say, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny," like they're acknowledging his death, but they're not. It's more like a reflex, something they say without understanding what it means. By the next scene, they've completely forgotten Kenny existed. The phrase is hollow because there's no real grief behind it. Kenny died, they said the words, and then they erased him from their memory. The catchphrase also raises questions about who "they" refers to. Who killed Kenny? Sometimes it's specific characters. Sometimes it's random accidents. Sometimes it's Kenny's own actions. But Stan and Kyle always say "they" like there's an external force responsible. Maybe the "they" is the universe itself. Maybe it's the curse. Maybe it's the writers of South Park who keep orchestrating his deaths for entertainment. What the show is really exploring here is what it feels like to be invisible. Every kid has experienced being ignored or forgotten by their peer group. Kenny's curse is just the supernatural extreme version of that universal childhood fear. He matters so little to the world around him that his absence doesn't register. He could disappear permanently and nobody would notice beyond a brief catchphrase. The death cycle also explains why Kenny rarely talks. His voice is muffled by his parka, which makes everything he says incomprehensible to others. But more than that, why bother speaking when nobody will remember what you said? Why form deep relationships when those relationships reset every time you die? Kenny's silence isn't just a character quirk, it's learned helplessness. He's given up on being heard because the universe has proven repeatedly that his voice doesn't matter. When Kenny does speak clearly, it's almost always as Mysterian. The mask gives him permission to use his voice because Mysterian is memorable in a way Kenny McCormick can never be. People remember what Mysterian says even if they forget Kenny exists. The superhero identity becomes the only way Kenny can participate in his own life with any permanence. In the episode Best Friends Forever, Kenny dies and goes to heaven. God explains that Kenny is needed for some cosmic war between good and evil. But while Kenny's in heaven being told he's important, his body is on life support on Earth. Cartman wants to pull the plug so he can get Kenny's PSP. Kyle wants to keep him alive out of principle. They turn Kenny's death into a political circus about right-to-die legislation, while Kenny's consciousness is trapped in the afterlife watching it happen. This episode reveals something important. Even when Kenny escapes the death loop temporarily by staying dead, he still can't find peace. Heaven needs him for a war. Earth is fighting over his corpse for selfish reasons. His death becomes about everyone except him. Death should be an escape from his curse, but it's just another form of being used and forgotten. The Terry Schiavo satire in this episode works on multiple levels. On the surface, it's mocking the media circus around right-to-die cases. But for Kenny specifically, it's showing how even his permanent death becomes commodified and politicized. Kyle and Cartman aren't arguing about what Kenny would want. They're arguing about their own ideological positions, using Kenny's body as evidence. His agency disappears even in death. The show brings Kenny back after this episode, of course. The death loop reasserts itself. Whatever cosmic importance he had in heaven doesn't transfer to his daily life. He goes back to being poor Kenny McCormick who dies constantly and gets forgotten immediately. The brief moment of being special and needed evaporates. What makes Kenny's character so tragic is that he's the moral center of the group in his own quiet way. As Mysterian, he genuinely tries to help people. When he sees Justin Bieber's music causing babies to explode, he investigates. When he sees Cartman abusing his coon powers, he stands up to him. Kenny isn't just suffering through his curse passively, he's actively trying to make the world better despite knowing his efforts will be forgotten. This is what separates Kenny from the other kids. Stan, Kyle, and Cartman are all self-centered in their own ways. They help people when it benefits them or proves a point. Kenny helps because helping is right, even when nobody will remember or thank him. He's developed a moral code independent of social recognition because social recognition is impossible for him. His heroism is pure because it's unrewarded. Stan gets to feel good about saving people. Kyle gets to prove his moral superiority. Cartman gets attention even when he's not helping. Kenny saves people in silence, knowing he'll die soon and nobody will remember his contribution. That's genuine altruism, stripped of all ego and social reward. The cult aspect adds another layer of horror to Kenny's existence. His parents' religious devotion is the direct cause of his suffering, but they won't abandon the cult. They keep attending meetings, keep worshiping Cthulhu, keep participating in the system that tortured their son. This suggests the curse might be permanent because breaking it would require his parents to choose their son over their beliefs, and they've proven repeatedly they won't make that choice. The McCormick's continued cult participation raises questions about addiction and community. Maybe they can't leave the cult because it's the only social structure they have. They're the poorest family in South Park, isolated and looked down on by everyone. The cult accepts them. It gives them purpose and belonging. Leaving would mean admitting they condemned their son for something that didn't even provide lasting value. They're trapped by sunk cost fallacy applied to their child's soul. Kenny's poverty intersects with his curse in interesting ways. The McCormicks are the poorest family in South Park. They can't afford proper food, heating, or clothing. Kenny's orange parka is all he has to protect him from the cold. So not only is he cursed with eternal death, he's cursed with eternal poverty too. He dies and wakes up in the same terrible circumstances every single time. There's no escape from either trap. The show hints that Kenny's deaths might be preventable if he had resources. When he dies from accidentally huffing paint thinner while doing household tasks, that's a poverty death. When he dies from food poisoning, from expired food, that's a poverty death. Some of his deaths are freak accidents that could happen to anyone, but many of them result directly from the unsafe living conditions his poverty creates. The curse makes him immortal, but poverty makes immortality into torture. Kenny's deaths from poverty reveal how systemic inequality kills people slowly and repeatedly. He dies from eating old food because his family can't afford fresh groceries. He dies from unsafe living conditions because they can't afford repairs. He dies from lack of supervision because his parents are too busy working or drinking to watch him. Each death is caused by circumstances that money could prevent. But the McCormicks will never have money, which means Kenny will keep dying from poverty forever. Kenny's relationship with his sister Karen reveals the only person in his life who actually matters to him. He protects her fiercely as Mysterian. When bullies threaten her, he intervenes. When she's sad about their family's poverty, he tries to cheer her up. Karen is too young to understand the death curse, which means she's the only person Kenny can have a somewhat normal relationship with. She doesn't forget him because she never fully remembers him dying in the first place. But this means Kenny is raising his little sister while being a child himself and dealing with infinite trauma. He's parentified on top of everything else. His actual parents are too busy with cult meetings and alcoholism to properly care for Karen, so Kenny steps in. He's simultaneously dealing with cosmic horror, extreme poverty, and family responsibility. That's too much weight for an adult, let alone a 9-year-old. The Mysterian identity represents Kenny's attempt to have control over something. He can't control when he dies. He can't control whether people remember him. He can't control his family's poverty. But as Mysterian, he can control when helps people and how he presents himself. The mask gives him agency that Kenny McCormick could never have. It's not about being a superhero. It's about being seen and remembered, even if people don't know who's behind the mask. When Mysterian throws himself off buildings to prove his immortality to his friends, it's not suicidal ideation exactly. It's a desperate cry for acknowledgement. He's proving that his curse is real, that his suffering has meaning, that he's not crazy for claiming he dies and resurrects. But even this fails. His friends see him jump and survive, but they still don't grasp what it means. They move on to other concerns. Kenny's proof evaporates without changing anything. The scene where Mysterian jumps is played for both comedy and tragedy. The other kids watch him fall to his death, expecting some trick or safety measure. When he actually dies and then appears alive the next day, they're confused but not enlightened. They rationalize it somehow, or forget it happened, or just don't care enough to investigate further. Kenny can't even prove his curse is real, because the curse includes mechanisms to prevent proof from being remembered. The death cycle makes Kenny the most existentially aware character in South Park. He understands that life is temporary, pain is inevitable, and memory is fragile. He knows these things from direct, repeated experience rather than abstract philosophy. While other characters worry about social status or petty revenge, Kenny operates from a perspective shaped by death itself. He's the only person in town who truly understands mortality, which makes him the only one who doesn't fear it. But that fearlessness isn't strength, it's resignation. Kenny doesn't fear death because death is his baseline reality. It's not something that might happen someday. It's something that happens constantly and will continue happening forever. He's not brave for accepting this. He's just exhausted. The show occasionally hints that Kenny wishes the curse would end permanently. In some episodes, he seems almost relieved when death approaches, like maybe this time it will stick. But it never does. He always wakes up in his bed wearing his orange parka, ready to experience another day that will probably end in violence. Hope becomes another form of torture when it's repeatedly denied. Kenny's story asks whether immortality is actually desirable. Most people imagine living forever as an adventure, a chance to experience everything. Kenny's immortality is the opposite. It's experiencing death repeatedly, waking up to the same poverty, watching the same people forget you, helping people who won't remember being helped. Immortality without memory or agency is just an infinite prison sentence. The curse ultimately reveals that Kenny is trapped not just by supernatural forces, but by the show's format itself. South Park needs Kenny to die and return, because that's one of its defining gags. Kenny can't permanently escape the death loop, because doing so would fundamentally change the show's identity. He's trapped by narrative necessity as much as by Cthulhu's curse. His suffering serves the show's entertainment value, which makes the audience complicit in his torture every time we laugh at his deaths. This meta-textual layer adds another dimension to Kenny's tragedy. He exists to die for our entertainment. The Mysterian trilogy acknowledges this while continuing to kill him anyway. The show admits Kenny's suffering is real and meaningful, then keeps inflicting it because that's what Kenny is for. He's a sacrifice to the gods of comedy, resurrecting endlessly to serve a purpose he never chose. Now let's talk about Butters and the systematic destruction of childhood innocence, but don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Butters Stotch is the only genuinely good person in South Park, which is why the universe punishes him more brutally than any other character. His parents ground him for things he didn't do. The kids use him as a patsy, and even when he tries to be bad, he fails at it in the most wholesome way possible. Butters represents what happens when pure childhood innocence collides with a world designed to crush it, and somehow he keeps getting back up. The defining episode for understanding Butters is Butters' very own episode from Season 5. This episode follows Butters through what should be a normal day, but slowly reveals the nightmare of his home life. His dad Steven is acting strange, sneaking around, and Butters notices. Being a good kid who trusts his parents, Butters follows his father to find out what's wrong, thinking maybe he can help. What Butters discovers is that his father is visiting gay bathhouses. Steven Stotch is a closeted gay man living in denial, and Butters witnessing this sends his father into a panic. Instead of explaining or dealing with his own sexuality honestly, Steven decides the easiest solution is to kill his son. Not metaphorically. He literally tries to murder Butters by driving him to a remote location and drowning him. A father attempts to murder his 8-year-old son to cover up his own sexual shame. Butters survives because his father is incompetent at murder. Steven thinks he's succeeded and drives away, leaving Butters alive in the water. When Steven gets home, he and his wife Linda immediately start creating a fake story about an intruder breaking in and kidnapping Butters. They practice their crying for the police. They manufacture evidence. They're more concerned with their alibi than with the fact that they think their son is dead. Linda doesn't know about Steven's sexuality or his murder attempt, but she goes along with the cover-up immediately. She doesn't question why they need a fake story. She doesn't ask what really happened. She just accepts that lying to the police is what they're doing now and commits to the performance. This tells you everything about the Stotch household. Appearances matter more than truth, and questioning authority isn't allowed. Meanwhile, Butters wanders home, not understanding what happened. He thinks he just went for a swim and his dad left without him. His innocence is so profound that he can't conceive of his own father trying to kill him. When he arrives home and sees police cars, he assumes he's in trouble for getting lost. His first instinct is to apologize for causing problems. The episode ends with Butters getting grounded for making his parents worry. He nearly died because his father tried to drown him, and his punishment is losing TV privileges. The show plays this straight without commentary. Butters accepts the grounding without protest because he's been conditioned to believe he deserves punishment for things he doesn't understand. This is Butters' entire character in one episode. He experiences genuine trauma and abuse, processes it as his own failure, apologizes for existing, and gets punished anyway. And he never becomes bitter or angry, because bitterness would require understanding that the world is treating him unfairly. Butters can't access that understanding without shattering his foundational belief that adults know best. His parents ground him constantly for increasingly absurd reasons. In one episode, they ground him for his grandmother's abuse toward him. His grandmother is physically and emotionally tormenting Butters, and when his parents find out, they ground Butters for letting it happen. The logic is inverted. The victim is responsible for the abuse because he should have prevented it somehow. The grandmother episodes reveal another layer of the Stotch family dysfunction. Butters' grandmother is cruel and vindictive, taking out her frustrations on a child who can't defend himself. She plays mind games, tells him he's worthless, and physically harms him. When Butters finally tells his parents what's happening, they don't believe him. They accuse him of lying about his grandmother and ground him for disrespecting his elders. This creates an impossible situation where Butters is being abused by multiple generations simultaneously. His grandmother torments him. His parents punish him for being tormented. He has no safe adults in his life. Every authority figure has failed him, but he continues believing in the authority of adults because the alternative is accepting that nobody is protecting him. This pattern repeats throughout the series. Butters gets grounded for Kyle making fun of him. He gets grounded for other kids bullying him. He gets grounded when his parents have bad days and need someone to punish. The grounding has nothing to do with Butters' behavior and everything to do with his parents' need to exercise control over something in their chaotic lives. The really dark part is how Butters has internalized this treatment as normal. When he gets grounded unfairly, he doesn't protest. He goes to his room and sits there thinking about what he supposedly did wrong. He's been gaslit so thoroughly that he believes he must be guilty of something even when he's objectively innocent. His parents have broken his ability to trust his own perception of reality. Professor Chaos emerges from this systematic abuse. After being excluded from Stan and Kyle's group one too many times, Butters decides to become a supervillain. He creates an elaborate costume, gives himself a menacing name, and sets out to wreak havoc on South Park. His acts of villainy include things like flooding a theater with a garden hose and leaving Legos on the floor where people might step on them. He can't even be bad correctly. Butters tries so hard to be evil, but his fundamental nature keeps sabotaging him. He wants to cause chaos, but he's constitutionally incapable of actually hurting people. His most destructive act is inconveniencing them slightly. Professor Chaos is what happens when the nicest person in the world tries to access anger and revenge, but can't find those emotions genuinely enough to make them work. His sidekick, General Disarray, who is Dougie, follows him around mostly because Dougie has nowhere else to be. The two of them plan elaborate schemes that always fail because Butters can't commit to actually harming anyone. When they try to block a road, Butters feels bad about the traffic jam. When they try to vandalize property, Butters worries about the cleanup crew. Being evil requires a level of selfishness that Butters simply doesn't possess. This makes Professor Chaos the saddest character in South Park. Butters is so damaged by constant rejection and abuse that he decides to embrace villainy, but he's so inherently good that even his villainy is wholesome. He wants to make people feel the pain he feels, but he can't translate that desire into action because causing pain goes against everything he is. The show uses Butters as the moral compass that other characters fail against. When Cartman needs someone to manipulate, Butters is the easiest target because he believes the best in people. When the kids need a scapegoat, Butters volunteers himself before anyone asks because he's been trained to take blame. When adults need someone to punish unfairly, Butters accepts it without complaint because he thinks he deserves it. In the Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers, the kids accidentally give Butters a pornographic video instead of the movie his parents wanted to rent. Butters watches it, not understanding what he's seeing, but knowing somehow that it's forbidden. When his parents find out, they don't explain. They punish. They send Butters to a special camp designed to cure him of corruption. The camp is a conversion therapy parody where counselors try to remove impure thoughts through humiliation and indoctrination. Butters endures this without understanding what he did wrong. He watched a video that adults gave him, and now he's being psychologically tortured for it. The episode shows how easily authority figures can abuse children through religious and moral panic, using Butters as the victim who accepts everything done to him as somehow deserved. What makes Butters different from other abused characters in media is his refusal to break. Most narratives show abuse victims either becoming abusers themselves or developing obvious trauma responses. Butters does neither. He remains optimistic, helpful, and genuinely kind despite everything. This is either the most resilient character ever written or the most damaged, and the show deliberately leaves it ambiguous which interpretation is correct. His relationship with his parents never improves. Stephen and Linda continue being terrible throughout the series, and Butters continues accepting their behavior as normal. When Stephen takes Butters to Bennigan's as a treat and then orders him to lie about being sick so Stephen can get free meals, Butters complies immediately. He's learned that love from his parents is conditional on his willingness to participate in their schemes and absorb their punishment. The Butters Bottom Bitch episode reveals another layer of his character. Butters accidentally becomes a pimp and runs a surprisingly successful prostitution ring using girls from his class. He treats it like any other small business, keeping careful records and ensuring good customer service. The girls work for him, not through coercion, but because Butters is actually treating them better than anyone else in their lives. He's respectful, pays them fairly, and values their safety. This is somehow the most ethical prostitution ring imaginable, run by an 8-year-old who doesn't understand what prostitution is. Butters brings his wholesome worldview to an inherently exploitative industry and accidentally makes it functional and humane. When the police shut it down, Butters is confused about what he did wrong. He was providing a service people wanted while treating his workers well. The fact that it was illegal doesn't compute because his logic was sound. The show uses this to explore how morality and legality don't always align. Butters' prostitution ring was objectively better for the girls involved than many legal situations they find themselves in. But society punishes Butters for breaking rules without caring whether the rules make sense or whether breaking them caused actual harm. This reflects Butters' entire existence. He gets punished based on arbitrary standards that have nothing to do with morality or ethics. His capacity for forgiveness is both beautiful and disturbing. When his parents apologize for their behavior, which happens rarely, Butters accepts immediately with no lingering resentment. He doesn't hold grudges because holding grudges would require acknowledging that people did something wrong to him. Butters has been trained to assume everyone is doing their best, even when their best includes attempted murder. In Butterballs, Butters is being bullied by his grandmother, and the school responds with an anti-bullying video campaign instead of actually helping him. The video gets attention on YouTube, but the bullying continues because awareness campaigns don't stop abuse. Butters endures this while watching the video go viral, seeing his suffering turned into educational content that does nothing to improve his situation. His pain becomes entertainment and social commentary without translating into actual protection or support. This is South Park's commentary on performative activism. Society loves talking about bullying and abuse, but when confronted with actual victims who need help, the response is content creation rather than intervention. Butters suffers while people pat themselves on the back for raising awareness. The bullying continues because awareness was always the goal, not prevention. The anti-bullying video features Stan rapping about how bullying is bad. It goes viral and gets millions of views. People share it and comment about how important the message is. But nobody actually helps Butters. Nobody removes him from the situation. Nobody confronts his grandmother. The video becomes more important than the victim it's supposedly helping. This is modern activism in a nutshell, where visibility replaces action and content replaces care. Butters' dating life follows the same pattern as everything else. When he likes a girl, he treats her with genuine respect and affection. The girls usually respond by using him or cheating on him with someone more confident. Butters gets his heart broken repeatedly because his earnest affection reads as weakness to people who've learned to value cruelty and manipulation. Being nice makes him a target, not a catch. His first real crush involves him falling for a Raisins girl, which is South Park's version of Hooters. The girl is nice to him because that's her job. Butters interprets professional friendliness as genuine affection. When he returns to the restaurant repeatedly, spending money he doesn't have just to see her, she continues being nice because that's what gets tips. Butters leaves believing he's in a relationship. She leaves having successfully extracted money from a child who doesn't understand how service industry flirting works. The episode treats this with both humor and genuine pathos. Butters is being exploited, but he's also learning something real about how the world works. Not everyone who's nice to you actually likes you. Sometimes kindness is transactional. Sometimes people use your emotions against you for profit. These are hard lessons for adults, let alone 8-year-olds. His relationship with Cartman is particularly toxic. Cartman recognizes Butters as the perfect victim because Butters won't fight back effectively. When Cartman needs someone to blame for his failures, Butters accepts the blame. When Cartman needs someone to manipulate into doing his schemes, Butters complies without much resistance. Cartman has essentially trained Butters to be his servant through a combination of intimidation and exploiting Butters' desperate need for friendship. But occasionally, Butters shows flashes of awareness that make his continued compliance even more heartbreaking. In some episodes, he pushes back against Cartman or recognizes he's being used. These moments prove Butters isn't stupid. He knows he's being exploited. He just doesn't believe he deserves better or that he's capable of achieving better. His self-esteem is so destroyed that he accepts mistreatment as the best he's going to get. The saddest thing about Butters is that his goodness isn't naive innocence. It's a choice he makes despite overwhelming evidence that being good leads to suffering. He's been abused, exploited, and punished for things he didn't do. He's watched other kids succeed through meanness, while his kindness gets him nowhere. But he remains kind anyway, because changing would mean admitting that his parents, his friends, and society have failed him, and Butters can't admit that without his entire worldview collapsing. His character asks whether maintaining innocence in a cruel world is strength or delusion. Is Butters heroically refusing to let trauma corrupt him, or is he so damaged that he can't process trauma as trauma? The show never answers this question definitively because both interpretations are true simultaneously. Butters is both the strongest and most broken character in South Park. What makes his story resonate is how common his experience is. Most people don't have parents who attempt murder, but many people have parents who prioritize appearance over well-being, who punish children for adult failures, who gaslight kids into accepting abuse as normal. Butters is an extreme version of something real, and his refusal to become bitter, despite everything, makes him the show's unlikely moral center. He represents the possibility that goodness can survive anything, even systematic attempts to destroy it. But he also represents the cost of that survival. Butters maintains his innocence by dissociating from reality, accepting abuse as love, and believing his suffering is deserved. That's not recovery. That's coping through delusion. The question is whether delusional happiness is better than aware misery, and Butters chooses delusional happiness every single time. Now let's move on to Scientology, Xenu, and the Tom Cruise closet incident. South Park literally put the actual Scientology creation myth on television with a disclaimer saying, "This is what Scientologists actually believe." Then they trapped Tom Cruise in a closet and refused to let him out. And somehow, this was one of the most legally dangerous things the show ever did. The episode Trapped in the Closet aired in 2005 and immediately became controversial. Stan takes a personality test at the Scientology Center and scores so highly that the Scientologists believe he's the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of their religion. They bring him to meet their leaders, who all start worshiping Stan as the return of their Messiah. What makes this episode brilliant is how it presents Scientology's origin story. The show literally just tells the Xenu story straight, adding a subtitle that reads, "This is what Scientologists actually believe," whenever the story gets particularly absurd. And the story is incredibly absurd. Xenu was an alien dictator who ruled a galactic confederation 75 million years ago. He solved overpopulation by bringing billions of people to Earth, stacking them around volcanoes, and blowing them up with hydrogen bombs. The spirits of these dead aliens now cling to humans and cause psychological problems. That's the actual Scientology creation myth. South Park didn't exaggerate or mock it. They just presented it as Scientologists teach it, with dramatic recreations showing spaceships and volcanoes and alien souls. The disclaimer was necessary because otherwise viewers would assume the show was making it up. The truth is stranger than any parody could be. The episode also features Tom Cruise literally hiding in a closet. Stan tells Cruise that he thinks his acting is just okay, not amazing. Cruise takes this as a devastating insult, runs into a closet, and refuses to come out. Stan, his dad Randy, and various Scientology leaders spend the episode trying to coax Cruise out of the closet. The joke is obvious. Tom Cruise won't come out of the closet. The closet becomes a metaphor that the episode never explicitly states, but constantly reinforces. R. Kelly shows up later and also hides in the closet with Cruise. John Travolta arrives and considers joining them in the closet. The episode keeps adding famous Scientologists to this cramped closet space while Stan tries to convince them all to come out. The metaphor gets less subtle with every scene, but the episode maintains plausible deniability by never explicitly stating what the closet represents. The legal implications of this episode were massive. Scientology has a reputation for aggressively litigating against critics. They've sued journalists, activists, and anyone who tries to expose their practices. South Park knew this and did it anyway. The show's lawyers must have worked overtime ensuring every claim was either factually accurate or clearly satirical opinion protected by the First Amendment. Isaac Hayes, who voiced Chef, quit the show over this episode. Hayes was a Scientologist, and he released a statement saying he could no longer be part of a show that was intolerant toward religious beliefs. The irony is that South Park had mocked every other religion extensively before this. They'd done episodes about Mormons, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, and more. But Hayes only quit when they targeted Scientology. This proved the show's point about how Scientology treats criticism differently than other religions do. Hayes' departure created problems because Chef was a beloved character and a voice of reason for the kids. The show handled this by killing Chef in the most brutal way possible. They created a Frankenstein episode using old Isaac Hayes voice clips, making Chef join a child molesting cult called the Super Adventure Club. Then they had him fall off a cliff, get impaled, burned, shot, and mauled by a mountain lion and a bear. It was excessive and clearly vengeful, but it also sent a message that nobody is bigger than the show. Comedy Central initially pulled the episode from rotation under pressure from Scientology and Tom Cruise. Rumors circulated that Cruise threatened to boycott promotion for Mission Impossible 3, which was produced by Paramount, Comedy Central's parent company. The corporate pressure worked temporarily. The episode vanished from reruns and wasn't available anywhere legally. But the Streisand effect kicked in. Trying to suppress the episode made more people want to see it. Bootleg copies spread online. The controversy generated more attention than the episode would have received from normal broadcasting. Eventually, Comedy Central brought it back into rotation because keeping it banned was causing more problems than airing it. The episode's lasting impact is how it exposed Scientology to mainstream ridicule. Before Trapped in the Closet, most people didn't know the details of Scientology's beliefs. They knew it was a religion that celebrities joined, but not what those celebrities actually believed. South Park explained Xanu and Thetans and all the weird science fiction mythology in terms anyone could understand. The episode became required viewing for understanding what Scientology actually teaches. Scientology's response revealed their biggest weakness. They couldn't sue because everything South Park said was either true or protected opinion. They couldn't ignore it because the episode was too popular. They couldn't mock it back because taking South Park seriously would make them look worse. Their usual tactics of intimidation and litigation didn't work against a comedy show with strong legal backing and nothing to lose. The "this is what Scientologists actually believe" disclaimer was genius legal protection. By stating explicitly that they're presenting Scientology's actual beliefs, the show couldn't be accused of making false statements. If Scientology sued claiming defamation, they'd have to argue in court that they don't actually believe their own religious doctrines. That's a legal trap with no good exit. The episode also works as commentary on celebrity worship and religious authority. The Scientologists treat Stan as L. Ron Hubbard, reincarnated based on a personality test. They immediately defer to his authority because he scored well on their metrics. This mirrors how Scientology treats celebrities in real life, giving them special status and access based on their fame and money rather than their spiritual accomplishments. Stan's reaction to being worshipped is to reject it completely. He doesn't want to be L. Ron Hubbard. He doesn't want people treating him as special. He just wants to go home and be a normal kid. This is South Park's typical protagonist move, where the reasonable person surrounded by insanity just wants everything to go back to normal. Stan becomes the audience surrogate, expressing what we'd all feel if trapped in this situation. The ending of the episode has Stan publicly resigning from Scientology, which is a huge deal within their organization. He tells everyone that Scientology is a scam designed to make money off people's insecurities. He says L. Ron Hubbard made it all up. He explicitly calls it a con job. And then he walks away while Tom Cruise remains stuck in the closet. This ending is South Park at its most direct. Usually the show drowns its messages in layers of irony and absurdity. Here, they just state plainly that Scientology is a scam. There's no joke, no twist, no subversion. Stan looks at the camera and tells the audience that this religion is a fraud designed to extract money from vulnerable people. The show abandons subtlety because the truth is damning enough without embellishment. The fact that Scientology couldn't effectively retaliate proved Stan's point. If they were a legitimate religion, they could have engaged with the criticism or ignored it like other faiths do. Instead, they tried to suppress it through corporate pressure and intimidation. Their response validated everything South Park was saying about how they operate. Now let's talk about Satan's tragic love life and the hierarchy of hell. Satan, the literal Prince of Darkness, is the most emotionally vulnerable character in South Park. He's in an abusive relationship with Saddam Hussein, constantly seeking validation from hell's denizens, and throws a birthday party where nobody shows up. The personification of evil is just a lonely guy with terrible taste in men. Satan first appears in the South Park movie, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, as a surprisingly sympathetic character. He's in a relationship with Saddam Hussein, who treats him terribly. Saddam is manipulative, demanding, and only interested in Satan for power and sex. Satan knows the relationship is toxic, but can't bring himself to end it. He keeps hoping Saddam will change, or that their love will become genuine, despite all evidence to the contrary. The movie presents their relationship as a dark comedy version of every toxic relationship anyone's ever witnessed. Saddam wants Satan to help him take over the world. Satan wants Saddam to appreciate him as a person. Saddam gives fake apologies and empty promises. Satan forgives him every time. They fight, break up, get back together, and repeat the cycle. It's abuse disguised as passion, and Satan is the victim who can't recognize what's happening to him. What makes this so weird is that Satan is literally the devil. He commands legions of demons. He rules hell. He has infinite power over the damned, but he can't stand up to one dead dictator who manipulates him through emotional abuse and intermittent affection. The ultimate symbol of evil and temptation becomes a textbook example of how abusive relationships trap even the strongest people when emotional manipulation is involved. The movie ends with Satan finally standing up to Saddam and banishing him back to hell permanently. It's a triumphant moment where Satan chooses self-respect over codependency. He realizes he deserves better than someone who treats him like a means to an end. The character arc is played completely straight, despite the absurdity of Satan learning to love himself and set boundaries. But later episodes show Satan still struggling with loneliness and validation. In Hell on Earth 2006, Satan throws a huge Halloween costume party and invites everyone he knows. He spends enormous amounts of money on decorations and catering. He wants everything perfect. The episode reveals Satan as someone desperately trying to prove he's likable and popular, despite being the embodiment of evil. The party planning scenes show Satan as remarkably relatable. He worries about seating arrangements. He stresses about the guest list. He wants to make sure everyone has a good time. He's not planning this party to corrupt souls or spread evil. He just wants people to like him. The Prince of Darkness has the same social anxieties as anyone throwing a party and worrying nobody will show up. The episode's big twist is that Steve Irwin shows up to the party in a costume that looks exactly like Steve Irwin with a stingray stuck in his chest. Everyone thinks it's in terrible taste because Steve Irwin just died that way in real life. They kick him out for being offensive, except it actually is Steve Irwin, fresh dead and in hell, trying to attend the party. Nobody believes him because his real appearance is too shocking to accept as genuine. This creates a darkly funny situation where the most earnest guest gets ejected for being too authentic. Steve Irwin isn't mocking death. He literally just died and showed up in hell still wearing his wounds. But modern sensibilities around good taste prevent anyone from accepting that sometimes reality is more offensive than any costume could be. Satan's character throughout the series serves as the show's unlikely moral center. He gives advice to characters dealing with relationship problems. He helps people learn self-respect and boundaries. He models healthy emotional expression despite being literally evil incarnate. The joke is that the devil is more emotionally mature and ethically grounded than most of the humans in South Park. This inverts traditional religious narratives where Satan is the tempter leading people astray. In South Park, Satan is the one humans should listen to because he's actually trying to help them make good choices. He's been through abusive relationships and learned from them. He understands emotional manipulation because Saddam used it against him. His advice comes from hard-won experience with suffering. The show occasionally reveals details about Hell's bureaucracy and hierarchy. Hell has VIP sections for famous people. There are different levels based on how evil you were in life. The organization suggests Hell functions like any other large institution with rules, procedures, and middle management. Satan isn't just a symbol of evil. He's an administrator running a complex organization with millions of souls to process. The VIP section of Hell becomes important in multiple episodes. Famous evil people like Hitler and serial killers get special treatment, which seems backward until you realize Hell is still governed by human concepts of fame and status. Even in eternal damnation, celebrities get better accommodations. This satirizes how fame operates in the living world, where being notorious is functionally identical to being legitimately famous in terms of social capital. Satan's homosexuality is presented without comment or mockery. He's gay, and in relationships with men, and this is treated as completely normal by Hell's residents and Earth's population. The joke is never that Satan is gay. The joke is that he has terrible taste in men and stays in toxic relationships despite knowing better. His sexuality is just a fact about his character, not a punchline. This is actually progressive for a show known for offensive humor. South Park could have made Satan's sexuality the butt of jokes. Instead, they made his poor relationship choices the comedy, while treating his orientation as unremarkable. The show treats him exactly how it treats straight characters in bad relationships, focusing on the dysfunction rather than the identity. In one episode, Satan comes to Earth seeking advice about his relationship problems. He ends up talking to the kids about whether he should leave Saddam or give him another chance. The kids, being children, have no useful advice, but they try to help anyway because even they can see that Satan is miserable and deserves better. The episode ends without resolution because some relationship problems don't have easy answers, even with outside perspective. What makes Satan tragic is how familiar his problems are. Everyone knows someone stuck in a bad relationship, making excuses for their partner, hoping things will improve despite all evidence. Satan is that friend, except he's also the Lord of Darkness with infinite power. The contrast between his cosmic significance and his very human emotional struggles creates the comedy while maintaining genuine pathos. Satan's journey toward self-actualization happens gradually across multiple episodes. He learns to value himself. He stops accepting poor treatment. He realizes he doesn't need a partner to be complete. These are standard character development beats for any relationship storyline, but seeing them happen to Satan makes them both funny and touching simultaneously. The show uses Satan to explore how abuse victims often have more power than they realize. Satan could destroy Saddam effortlessly. He's the devil. But emotional abuse doesn't work through physical power. It works through psychological manipulation that makes victims doubt themselves and accept treatment they'd never tolerate if they were thinking clearly. Satan's physical power is irrelevant against Saddam's emotional manipulation. Now let's move on to the Coon trilogy and the fractured superhero universe. Cartman creates a superhero identity called the Coon, specifically so he can be in charge of something. When the other kids create their own heroes and refuse to follow his rules, he literally becomes the villain and teams up with Cthulhu to destroy them. This is Cartman's entire personality in superhero form. The Coon first appears trying to fight crime in South Park, but mostly just assaulting people he suspects of wrongdoing. He has no actual powers. His costume is homemade and looks ridiculous, but Cartman commits to the character with absolute seriousness, referring to himself as the Coon in third person and speaking in a gravelly Batman voice. He genuinely believes he's making South Park safer despite accomplishing nothing except minor property damage and assault. The problem starts when another superhero appears called Mysterion, who's actually effective at fighting crime. Mysterion investigates real problems, helps actual victims, and becomes popular with the community. The Coon can't handle this competition for attention. Cartman doesn't care about helping people. He cares about being recognized as a hero. When someone else gets that recognition, his entire identity collapses. Cartman responds by trying to unmask Mysterion and reveal his identity to destroy his reputation. This backfires when Mysterion turns out to be Kenny, and Kenny's big reveal about his death curse steals all the attention from the Coon. Cartman's plan to expose his rival instead gives his rival the most compelling superhero origin story possible. Kenny's immortality curse makes him more interesting than anything Cartman could fabricate. This drives Cartman to create Coon and Friends, a superhero franchise where he's the leader and everyone else is a sidekick. He recruits the other kids to be superheroes under his command. Each kid develops their own hero identity with powers and costumes, but Cartman writes the rules to ensure the Coon always gets final say on all decisions. It's not really a team, it's a dictatorship with superhero branding. The other kids initially go along with this because they enjoy having superhero identities. Toolshed, Stan, can fix things. The human kite, Kyle, can fly. Mosquito, Clyde, has bug powers. Tupperware, Token, now Tolkien, stores things in his container-based armor. Mintberry Crunch, Bradley, is a complete mystery until much later. Each kid brings something useful to the team except Cartman, whose only contribution is leadership he doesn't deserve and didn't earn. The cracks appear when Coon and Friends try to actually fight crime and make decisions. Cartman refuses to listen to anyone else's ideas. He dismisses strategic suggestions because they didn't come from him. He takes credit for everyone else's successes and blames them for failures. The team dynamic becomes toxic immediately because Cartman sees the superhero team as a vehicle for personal glory rather than collaborative crime fighting. Mysterion refuses to join Coon and Friends because he understands Cartman's true motives. Kenny knows Cartman doesn't care about helping people. The refusal to join drives Cartman insane. He can't have the most popular hero in town outside his organization. That's a threat to his authority. So Cartman does what he always does. When he can't control someone, he tries to destroy them. Cartman's plan involves discrediting Mysterion by framing him for crimes and revealing him to be a fraud. But Kenny's genuine heroism and immortality curse make him impossible to discredit. People believe in Mysterion because he's actually helped them. Cartman's schemes fail because you can't fake the kind of reputation Mysterion has built through authentic heroism. The situation escalates when Cthulhu arrives on Earth, a cosmic horror entity from H.P. Lovecraft's mythology. Cartman sees an opportunity. He befriends Cthulhu and convinces the ancient god to help him destroy everyone who doesn't respect the Coon. This decision transforms Cartman from delusional wannabe hero into actual supervillain. He's actively working with a force of cosmic destruction to hurt his former friends because they wouldn't acknowledge his authority. The image of Cartman riding Cthulhu through the air while the monster destroys entire cities is both hilarious and disturbing. Cartman has a big smile on his face, living out his ultimate power fantasy. Below them, people die by the thousands. Cartman doesn't care about the casualties. He finally has the power and recognition he always wanted, and that's all that matters to him. Coon and friends have to fight Cartman and Cthulhu, which means former teammates are now trying to stop what they helped create. They enabled Cartman by joining his team and accepting his leadership. Now they're dealing with the consequences of giving power to someone who was never qualified to wield it. The superhero story becomes an allegory for how authoritarian leaders rise to power with the help of good people who don't recognize the danger until it's too late. The trilogy includes extensive scenes of Cartman and Cthulhu destroying cities and murdering people that Cartman personally dislikes. They go to San Francisco and destroy the entire city because Cartman hates their liberal politics. They travel around eliminating everyone who ever insulted Cartman or failed to appreciate him. It's genocide powered by petty grievances, and Cartman treats it like a vacation. Coon and friends eventually stop Cthulhu by exploiting the one thing the ancient god fears, his dad. Mint Berry Crunch, Bradley, is revealed to be an alien with powers specifically designed to combat Cthulhu. His backstory involves being sent to Earth as a baby like Superman, except his mission was to protect the Earth from threats like Cthulhu. Bradley's entire existence was preparation for this exact moment. The Mint Berry Crunch revelation works as both parody and genuine plot twist. On one hand, it's mocking how superhero stories introduce convenient new powers exactly when needed. On the other hand, Bradley's earnest heroism and genuine powers make him effective where everyone else failed. He's not the leader or the most popular hero. He's just the right person in the right place with the right abilities. Cartman loses his alliance with Cthulhu and is abandoned by everyone. The Coon franchise collapses. Cartman is left with nothing because he built everything on false premises and abused everyone who tried to help him. The typical Cartman story arc plays out where his schemes implode due to his own selfishness and inability to value other people. But the trilogy also reveals something important about how Cartman sees the world. He genuinely believes he deserves to lead because he came up with the idea first. In his mind, creating the concept of Coon and friends means he owns it forever, and everyone else is obligated to follow his rules. This is Cartman's understanding of intellectual property and leadership. The person with the initial idea deserves permanent control regardless of competence or contribution. The superhero framework allows the show to examine power dynamics and authority in ways that wouldn't work with the kids just being kids. Giving them costumes and code names creates enough narrative distance to explore how leaders emerge, how teams function, and how power corrupts without directly lecturing about real-world politics. Cartman becomes a fascist dictator, but because he's dressed as a raccoon fighting crime, it's funny and disturbing simultaneously. The Coon trilogy shows us that Cartman would rather destroy something than share it. He starts Coon and friends to be the leader. When leadership is challenged, he sides with a cosmic horror entity to maintain control. When that fails, he loses everything because he never built genuine relationships or earned real loyalty. His authority was always based on manipulation and self-appointment rather than merit or consent. Now let's move on to member berries and the weaponization of nostalgia. Member berries are literally addictive fruits that make you remember the past as better than it was. They start by making you remember Star Wars and Chewbacca, but eventually they're making you remember when there weren't so many Mexicans. And somehow, this becomes a commentary on how nostalgia got weaponized into political propaganda. The member berries first appear as cute little berries with faces and pleasant voices. They say things like "member Chewbacca" and "member when there weren't so many Mexicans." The juxtaposition is jarring. They mix innocent childhood memories with racist nostalgia, showing how the mechanism of nostalgia doesn't distinguish between harmless reminiscence and dangerous longing for a discriminatory past. Randy becomes addicted to member berries almost immediately. He eats them constantly, losing himself in pleasant memories of the past. The berries make him feel good by reminding him of times he perceives as simpler and better. He doesn't question why those times felt better or what made them good. He just consumes the nostalgia uncritically. This addiction to nostalgia becomes a metaphor for how people consume political messaging in the 2016 election. Make America Great Again is essentially bottled member berries. It promises a return to a past that was great without specifying when that was or what made it great. The vagueness allows everyone to project their own version of the good old days onto the slogan while ignoring what made those days good only for some people. The member berries gradually reveal their true nature throughout Season 20. They're not just fruit, they're sentient beings with an agenda. They gather in groups and discuss their plans to influence humanity. They want people nostalgic for a time when America was great, which to them means a time when white men had unquestioned authority and minorities knew their place. The berries discuss their strategy explicitly in scenes where they're alone. They know that nostalgia is a powerful drug. People want to believe the past was better. The berries exploit this by mixing innocent cultural references with subtle political messaging. They remind you of Star Wars and Reagan in the same sentence, creating a positive association between childhood joy and conservative politics. What makes member berries particularly insidious is how they start innocent and gradually become radicalized. At first, they're just remembering pop culture. Then they're remembering political figures. Then they're talking about demographic changes with disapproval. The escalation shows how nostalgia can be a gateway to more extreme ideologies. You start missing Star Wars and end up supporting policies that harm vulnerable populations. The show explicitly connects member berries to Trump's campaign without ever showing Trump directly. The berries represent the nostalgic appeal of his message. The promise of returning to a better time resonates with people who feel displaced by social progress. The berries feed on that displacement and amplify it into political action. Randy's addiction worsens as the season progresses. He can't stop eating member berries even though he knows they're influencing his thinking. The addiction makes him irritable when he can't access the berries. He starts experiencing withdrawal symptoms and cravings. His behavior changes as the berries reshape his worldview through constant reinforcement of nostalgic messaging. The member berries also infiltrate other aspects of society. They appear in schools, stores, and media. Their message spreads through consumption and repetition. People share berries with friends, spreading the addiction. The berries become a cultural phenomenon that changes how people think about the past and present simultaneously. In one scene, the member berries gather for a meeting and discuss their ultimate plan: to reboot the Galactic Empire from Star Wars in real life. They want to restore an authoritarian government modeled after fictional fascists. The berries are using nostalgia for beloved movies to make actual fascism appealing. They're not even subtle about this plan. They literally say they want to bring back the empire. This connects to how fascist movements often use cultural touchstones and national mythology to build support. The Nazis used German folk traditions and Wagner operas. The member berries use Star Wars and 1980s American culture. The specific references change, but the strategy remains constant. Link the movement to things people already love and trust. The season explores how nostalgia blinds people to present problems. Randy and others who eat member berries spend so much time reminiscing about the past that they stop engaging with current reality. They want to return to how things were rather than improve how things are. This backwards focus prevents progress and maintains systems that harm marginalized groups. Member berries also represent how media reboots and revivals exploit nostalgia for profit. Hollywood keeps remaking old properties instead of creating new ones. Audiences keep paying to relive their childhood rather than experience new stories. The cultural landscape becomes dominated by references to the past at the expense of innovation and growth. The berries' plan ultimately fails when enough characters recognize what's happening and resist. but the season ends ambiguously about whether the berries are truly defeated or just dormant. Their message has spread too far to be completely eliminated. The nostalgia they weaponized continues influencing people even after the berries themselves are removed. South Park's handling of member berries shows how the show evolved its satire. Instead of just mocking Trump voters or liberal reactions, they identified the underlying mechanism driving political polarization. Nostalgia is the drug, the past is the product being sold, and consumers are willing to sacrifice the present and future to recapture feelings they associate with a time that never really existed the way they remember it. The Member Berries arc demonstrates that South Park understands how propaganda works in the modern era. It's not about logical arguments or policy details. It's about emotional manipulation through cultural references and vague promises of returning to better times. The berries are smarter than the people consuming them because they understand that nostalgia bypasses critical thinking. Now let's talk about PC Principle and the war on language. PC Principle shows up as the new school principal and immediately starts beating up fourth graders for not using proper terminology. He's a parody of extreme political correctness, except the show gradually reveals he's actually one of the most sincere and well-meaning characters they've ever created. And that's way more interesting than simple mockery. PC Principal's introduction is deliberately provocative. He's a muscular fraternity bro who happens to be aggressively politically correct. His first day at school, he calls an assembly and announces that things are changing. Anyone who uses inappropriate language will face consequences. He's not asking for compliance. He's demanding it, and he enforces his demands through physical violence. When Cartman makes a joke using outdated terminology, PC Principal physically assaults him in front of the entire school. He beats up a 9-year-old child for saying something offensive. This is played for both comedy and horror. On one hand, it's funny watching Cartman get consequences for his behavior. On the other hand, a grown man beating up children is legitimately disturbing regardless of their language choices. PC Principle represents a specific type of progressive politics that emerged in the mid-2010s. He believes deeply in social justice principles, but expresses them through aggressive masculinity and physical intimidation. He's not a sensitive liberal stereotype. He's a gym bro who happens to care intensely about microaggressions and proper pronoun usage. This combination confuses everyone because it doesn't fit existing political stereotypes. The show initially seems to be mocking PC culture through this character. PC Principle is absurd, violent, and hypocritical. He preaches tolerance while beating people up. He demands respect while disrespecting everyone's autonomy. He's everything critics of political correctness imagine when they complain about thought police and language policing. But then the show does something unexpected. PC Principle turns out to be genuinely committed to his principles. He's not faking concern for marginalized groups to gain social status. He really believes that language matters and that protecting people from discrimination is important. His methods are wrong, but his motivations are sincere. He wants to make the school safer for everyone, especially students who've been historically marginalized. This complicates the satire significantly. South Park can't just mock PC culture when their PC character is actually morally right about most issues. They have to engage with the substance of what he's saying while criticizing how he says it. This creates more nuanced commentary than just declaring political correctness bad and moving on. The revelation that PC Principle is part of a nationwide fraternity of PC bros makes the satire even sharper. There's a whole organization of muscular men who aggressively enforce politically correct language. They meet in houses, drink beer, and work out while discussing microaggressions and safe spaces. Their frat culture and progressive politics merged into something neither camp quite recognizes. This fraternity aspect mocks how certain types of progressive activism can become cult-like. The PC bros all think the same way. They use the same language. They punish deviations from approved thinking. They create in-groups and out-groups based on ideological purity. The structure mirrors traditional fraternities, except the hazing is about memorizing proper terminology instead of drinking games. PC Principal's evolution over subsequent seasons shows the character becoming more three-dimensional. He develops a relationship with Strong Woman, the vice principal. He genuinely cares about students despite his violent methods. He stands up to authority when he believes principals are wrong. He maintains his core beliefs while learning to express them less abusively. The show uses PC Principal to explore how good intentions don't excuse bad behavior. He wants to protect vulnerable students from discrimination. That's admirable, but beating up children to enforce language rules is still wrong, even when done with pure motives. The ends don't justify the means, even when the ends are morally correct, and the means are directed at someone like Cartman, who probably deserves consequences. PC Principal also forces characters like Stan and Kyle to examine their own language and assumptions. When he calls them out for saying things they didn't realize were offensive, they have to decide whether to dismiss him as crazy or consider that maybe they should change how they speak. The show doesn't provide easy answers. Sometimes PC Principal is right. Sometimes he's overreaching. The complexity is the point. The Strong Woman relationship is particularly interesting because it shows PC Principal practicing what he preaches about gender equality. He respects her opinions, defers to her expertise, and treats her as an equal partner. Their relationship has problems, but none of them stem from sexism or traditional gender role expectations. PC Principal genuinely believes in equality and lives those values in his personal life. When Strong Woman becomes pregnant, PC Principal supports her completely without trying to control her choices or career. He handles the social pressure and judgment that comes with their relationship. He stands up to people who question whether Strong Woman should continue working as a pregnant woman in authority. His progressive beliefs aren't performative. They guide his actual behavior, even when it's personally difficult. The show also uses PC Principal to examine how institutions resist change. The school board doesn't like him because he's disrupting their comfortable routines. Parents complain about his methods even when his goals align with protecting their children. Other teachers resent having to modify their language and teaching methods. PC Principal represents change, and change is always met with resistance regardless of whether the change is positive. PC Principal's violence becomes a running question the show never fully resolves. Is it okay to punch Nazis? Is it okay to physically assault children who say offensive things? Where's the line between protecting vulnerable people and becoming an authoritarian enforcer? The show presents these questions through PC Principal's actions without providing definitive answers. What makes PC Principal work as a character is that he's genuinely trying to make things better. He's not pursuing personal power or status. He believes schools should be safer for marginalized students, and he's willing to fight to make that happen. His sincerity makes him more interesting than if he were just a hypocrite using progressive language for selfish purposes. The show's treatment of PC Principal evolved South Park's approach to political satire. Instead of just mocking movements or ideologies, they created a character who embodies the contradictions and complexities of modern progressive politics. PC Principal is right about many things. He's also violent and authoritarian about enforcing his correct beliefs. Both can be true simultaneously. Now let's move on to Imagination Land and the war between reality and fiction. Imagination Land is a place where every imaginary character ever created lives together. Care Bears hang out with Morpheus. Jason Voorhees is locked in the evil section with Freddy Krueger. And terrorists blow it all up because destroying imagination is more powerful than physical destruction. This is South Park at its most philosophical, disguised as a trilogy about Kyle sucking Cartman's balls. The Imagination Land trilogy starts with Cartman making a bet with Kyle. If leprechauns are real, Kyle has to suck Cartman's balls. Kyle agrees because leprechauns obviously don't exist. Then the kids immediately find a leprechaun who transports them to Imagination Land, where every fictional character lives together in a shared universe. Imagination Land is massive and elaborate. There are different sections for different types of imaginary things. Classic fairy tale characters have their own area. Modern superheroes have another section. Horror villains are locked in a contained evil zone. Everything humanity has ever imagined exists here in physical form. coexisting in this weird, shared space. The leprechaun explains that Imagination Land exists as a real place created by human imagination. When people imagine things strongly enough, those things manifest here. The characters have consciousness and live independent lives, even when nobody's actively thinking about them. They've created their own society with governments and infrastructure entirely separate from the human world. This raises immediate questions about the nature of reality and existence. If imaginary things exist in Imagination Land, are they still imaginary? Do they have the same rights as real people? When writers create characters, are they discovering beings that already exist or creating new life forms? The episode treats these philosophical questions seriously while maintaining its absurdist comedy tone. Then terrorists attack Imagination Land. Not imaginary terrorists, real terrorists from Earth who've discovered this place. They use suicide bombers to breach the barrier keeping evil imaginary characters contained. The explosion releases hundreds of horror movie villains and fictional monsters into the general population of Imagination Land. Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, the alien xenomorphs, and countless other killers start slaughtering the innocent imaginary characters. The attack is brutal. Strawberry Shortcake gets decapitated. The Care Bears are torn apart. Beloved childhood characters die horribly as horror villains rampage through their neighborhoods. The episode doesn't shy away from graphic violence despite the victims being children's entertainment icons. The clash between different fictional genres creates disturbing imagery that wouldn't exist if these characters stayed in their separate universes. The terrorist attack works as a metaphor for September 11th and subsequent War on Terror. The terrorists specifically targeted Imagination Land because destroying humanity's imagination is more damaging than physical destruction. If you can make people afraid to dream and create, you've defeated them more thoroughly than bombs ever could. Imagination is what separates humanity from animals. Take that away and you've destroyed the species without killing anyone. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Cartman is obsessed with making Kyle honor their bet. He hires lawyers and takes the case to court. The Supreme Court has to decide whether seeing an imaginary leprechaun in Imagination Land counts as the leprechaun being real. If Imagination Land is real, then the leprechaun is real, and Kyle has to suck Cartman's balls. If Imagination Land is imaginary, then the bet is void. This legal case becomes the B-plot running through all 3 episodes. While Imagination Land faces existential catastrophe, Cartman cares only about winning his bet. He's completely selfish and single-minded about getting what he's owed. The contrast between the stakes in both storylines is intentionally absurd. One plot involves the destruction of all human creativity. The other is about whether a child has to perform a humiliating sexual act on another child. The Supreme Court case raises genuine philosophical questions. Kyle's lawyer argues that imaginary things aren't real by definition. Cartman's lawyer argues that if you can perceive something and interact with it, that's the definition of real. The judges struggle with this because there's no clear legal precedent for determining the reality status of fictional characters who physically exist in a separate dimension. In Imagination Land, Butters becomes the key to saving everything. The terrorists captured him during their initial attack because they discovered Butters has special importance to imagination. He's pure and innocent enough that his imagination is more powerful than other people's. The terrorists want to use Butters to imagine something so terrible, it destroys Imagination Land entirely. The military gets involved and tries to nuke Imagination Land to prevent terrorists from controlling it. This is peak government logic. Destroy the thing to keep enemies from having it. The military sees Imagination Land as a potential weapon and decides preventing its use is more important than preserving humanity's collective imagination. They'd rather annihilate creativity than risk it being weaponized. Kurt Russell and Mel Gibson both appear as themselves dealing with the Imagination Land crisis. Kurt Russell represents reasonable Hollywood figures trying to help. Mel Gibson represents crazy Hollywood figures making everything worse. Gibson's presence is particularly funny given his real-life controversies. The episode came out after his anti-Semitic rants and DUI arrest, so including him in a story about imagination allows for meta commentary about separating art from artist. The evil imaginary characters organize under leadership and start building weapons to take over Imagination Land permanently. They're no longer content being contained. They want full control over the entire imaginary realm and possibly access to Earth. The horror villains form alliances with fictional dictators and monsters from various mythologies. It's every nightmare ever created forming an army against every pleasant dream. Kyle escapes Earth and travels to Imagination Land to help fight the evil imaginary forces. He doesn't care about the bet anymore. He cares about saving imagination itself. This is Kyle at his most idealistic, risking his life to preserve something abstract and beautiful that makes humanity worth saving. He understands that losing Imagination Land means losing the capacity for hope and wonder. The climax involves Butters using his imagination to create new characters and ideas powerful enough to defeat the evil forces. He imagines Santa Claus and Jesus Christ teaming up to fight Al Gore. Wait, that's wrong. He imagines heroes strong enough to restore order and rebuild the barriers containing evil. Butters saves Imagination Land by believing hard enough in good things that his imagination manifests them into existence with enough power to win. This resolution suggests that imagination itself is a moral force. Good ideas and positive creativity are stronger than evil when people commit to them fully. The episode becomes a passionate defense of human creativity and the importance of imagination for societal progress and individual happiness. Wrapped in absurdity and crude humor is a genuinely sincere message about preserving the capacity to dream. The Supreme Court rules that imaginary things are real if they have real effects on reality. Since Imagination Land existed and affected people, everything in it counts as real for legal purposes. This means Kyle has to honor his bet. Cartman has won. Kyle has to suck Cartman's balls because leprechauns are legally real. But Kyle refuses. He gives a speech about how some things matter more than rules and bets. He says imagination is more important than legal obligations. He admits he lost the bet, but won't honor it because doing so would validate Cartman's selfishness and reduce their entire adventure to a crude sexual act. Kyle chooses principles over rules, and this choice defines his character more than compliance ever could. Cartman is furious but can't actually force Kyle to comply. The episode ends without resolution to their bet. Cartman wanted Kyle's humiliation more than he cared about Imagination Land's survival. Kyle wanted to preserve something beautiful, regardless of personal cost. Their values are incompatible, and the show doesn't pretend otherwise. The Imagination Land trilogy works as South Park's most ambitious statement about fiction and creativity. They spent 3 full episodes exploring what imagination means to humanity and why it's worth protecting. They mixed crude humor about ball-sucking with genuine philosophical inquiry about the nature of reality and fiction. They created an epic that's both deeply silly and surprisingly profound. The trilogy also serves as meta-commentary on South Park itself. Everything in the show is imaginary. The characters aren't real people, but they have real effects on culture and society. They influence how people think about issues. They create conversations and change minds. If imaginary things with real effects count as real, then South Park itself becomes real through its impact, even though everyone knows the characters are fictional. Now, let's move on to Cartman's ginger supremacy movement. Cartman gives a presentation about how gingers don't have souls and starts a school-wide prejudice movement against red-haired kids. Then Kyle dyes Cartman's hair red while he's sleeping, and suddenly Cartman becomes a ginger supremacist leading the exact people he was just persecuting. This is fascism explained through hair color. The episode Ginger Kids starts with Cartman doing a school presentation on why people with red hair, pale skin, and freckles are genetically inferior to normal humans. He calls them gingers and claims they don't have souls. He uses charts and statistics to prove that gingers are less evolved and potentially dangerous to society. His presentation is structured like scientific racism from the early 20th century, complete with pseudo-scientific justifications for prejudice. The other kids immediately accept Cartman's premise and start treating the ginger kids differently. They avoid them in hallways. They don't want to sit near them. They make jokes about gingers stealing souls. The prejudice spreads instantly because Cartman gave them permission to discriminate by framing it as scientific fact. People want reasons to feel superior to others, and Cartman provided a convenient target. This shows how easily prejudice can be manufactured from nothing. Before Cartman's presentation, nobody cared about hair color. After his presentation, it's a major social dividing line. The arbitrary nature of the discrimination is the point. You can create hatred toward any group if you convince people there's a legitimate reason to fear or despise them. The ginger kids suffer real consequences. They're isolated, mocked, and excluded from social activities. Some of them internalize the message and start believing they're inferior. The psychological damage happens quickly because children are especially vulnerable to peer pressure and social rejection. What started as Cartman being an asshole becomes systematic oppression within days. Kyle, Stan, and Kenny realize this has gone too far. They need to teach Cartman a lesson about prejudice, so they break into Cartman's house while he's sleeping and dye his hair red, spray his face with freckles, and leave him looking like a ginger kid. When Cartman wakes up and sees his reflection, he has a complete breakdown. Cartman's first instinct is to think he's dying or transforming into something inhuman. He doesn't immediately question how his appearance changed overnight. He just accepts that he's become the thing he hates most. His self-loathing is instant and profound. He considers suicide. He thinks his life is over. He can't imagine continuing to exist as a ginger. Then Cartman goes to school expecting everyone to treat him the way he taught them to treat gingers. And they do. His friends avoid him. Other kids mock him. Everyone acts like he's infected with something contagious. Cartman experiences the discrimination he created, and it destroys him psychologically within hours. But instead of learning empathy from this experience, Cartman pivots immediately to survival. If he's a ginger now, he needs to change the social hierarchy so gingers are on top. He can't handle being at the bottom, so he'll put gingers at the top and everyone else at the bottom. His prejudice doesn't disappear. It just redirects toward whatever group he's not part of anymore. Cartman organizes the ginger kids into a supremacist movement. He gives speeches about how gingers are actually the superior race. He reframes all his original arguments in reverse. The things that made gingers inferior suddenly become markers of excellence. Red hair isn't genetic weakness, it's evolution toward perfection. Pale skin isn't sickness, it's purity. Lack of souls isn't a deficiency, it's liberation from human weakness. The ginger kids embrace this message because they're desperate for validation. They've been oppressed for days, and Cartman is offering them pride and power. He teaches them to see their difference as superiority rather than shame. This is exactly how supremacist movements recruit. Find people who've been made to feel inferior and tell them they're actually superior. Cartman organizes a nighttime rally where gingers gather and pledge loyalty to the cause. He gives a speech that mirrors historical fascist rhetoric. He talks about ginger pride and the need to protect themselves from those who hate them. He frames violence as self-defense and domination as justice. The rally ends with gingers marching through the streets intimidating non-gingers. The episode shows how quickly oppressed groups can become oppressors when given power. The ginger kids weren't interested in equality. They wanted revenge and dominance. Cartman gave them ideology and direction, transforming their hurt into organized hatred. The cycle of oppression continues with the victims becoming victimizers. Cartman plans Red Dawn, a night when gingers will rise up and exterminate non-gingers. He's organizing genocide based on hair color. The other kids realize they created this monster by trying to teach Cartman a lesson. Their prank backfired into actual fascism. Now they have to stop a movement they inadvertently started. Stan and Kyle reveal that Cartman isn't actually ginger. They show him proof that they dyed his hair while he slept. Cartman's entire supremacist phase was based on false belief about his own identity. When confronted with this truth, Cartman immediately abandons the ginger movement without guilt or reflection. He was never committed to the ideology. He was committed to being on top of whatever hierarchy existed. The ginger kids are devastated. Their leader was lying to them the whole time. The movement collapses instantly because it was built on Cartman's narcissism rather than genuine shared identity. The kids go back to being discriminated against because Cartman's influence disappears the moment his personal investment ends. Cartman shows no shame about any of this. He created prejudice from nothing, experienced that prejudice, organized a supremacist counter-movement, planned genocide, and then abandoned everything when it no longer benefited him. His complete lack of principles becomes the scariest thing about his character. He'll believe anything and do anything if it serves his immediate interests. The episode's ending is deliberately unsatisfying. The ginger kids are still discriminated against because Cartman's original presentation still influences people. The prejudice he manufactured doesn't disappear just because he's not ginger anymore. Ideas have momentum independent of their origin. Once planted, they grow on their own. Ginger Kids works as an allegory for how fascist movements operate. Find or create a marginalized group. Convince people that group is dangerous. Then either persecute them or, if you become part of that group, redirect the prejudice elsewhere while claiming victimhood and superiority simultaneously. Cartman demonstrates the fluidity of fascist identity, where the ideology matters less than the hierarchical structure with yourself on top. The episode also explores how people want permission to discriminate. Nobody questioned Cartman's claims about gingers because having an acceptable target for hatred is satisfying. Once Cartman gave them that permission through pseudoscience, they eagerly participated in oppression. The prejudice was always there. Cartman just gave it direction and justification. Now, let's move on to the pandemic specials and South Park's COVID meta-commentary. South Park made a pandemic special in 2020 while the pandemic was actively happening. They couldn't make fun of how it ended because it hadn't ended. So instead, they made an episode about how nobody knows how to act anymore, and everyone's mustache makes them look like Hitler. This is satire without the safety of distance. The pandemic special aired in September 2020, 6 months into COVID-19 lockdowns. This was unprecedented for South Park, which usually needs years of distance to process major events. The show creates episodes in 6 days, but those episodes typically satirize events that have concluded or at least stabilized. Making comedy about an ongoing crisis where people are dying daily required a completely different approach. The special opens with South Park Elementary attempting to reopen during the pandemic. The school has implemented safety protocols that make everything absurd. Students sit in plexiglass boxes. Teachers wear full hazmat suits. Everyone's terrified of touching anything. The atmosphere is paranoid and depressing, capturing the specific anxiety of early pandemic life when nobody knew how dangerous everyday activities were. The most memorable visual gag is how everyone wearing masks above their mustaches makes them look like Hitler. This is stupid and funny and somehow also profound. The episode treats this as a serious problem that the town must solve. They can't just shave the mustaches because then they'd look weird. They can't stop wearing masks because of the pandemic. They're trapped in a situation where following safety protocols accidentally makes everyone resemble history's most infamous dictator. This mustache problem becomes a metaphor for how the pandemic created impossible situations where every choice had downsides. Wear masks and look like Hitler, or don't wear masks and risk infection. The absurdity of the dilemma mirrors real pandemic debates, where every option seemed terrible and people fought viciously over which terrible option to choose. Randy is revealed to have possibly started the pandemic. In a flashback, he travels to China and has sexual relations with a bat and a pangolin, the two animals suspected of transmitting COVID to humans. The show doesn't definitively confirm Randy caused COVID, but heavily implies his reckless behavior in China might be patient zero for South Park's universe. This Randy subplot satirizes two things simultaneously. First, it mocks conspiracy theories about COVID's origin by making them literally true in the dumbest way possible. Second, it comments on how Americans love blaming everything on China without examining their own contributions to problems. Randy is America, reckless, selfish, and quick to deflect responsibility while secretly knowing he probably caused this. The school reopening highlights how impossible education became during COVID. Teachers are trying to maintain normalcy while wearing hazmat suits. Students can't interact or touch anything. The joy of childhood has been replaced by paranoid isolation. The special captures how heartbreaking it was watching kids lose their social development and normal childhood experiences to a virus nobody fully understood. Meanwhile, police brutality protests are happening simultaneously with the pandemic. The special aired months after George Floyd's murder, and South Park had to address both crises at once. The episode shows how these events overlapped and complicated each other. People wanted to protest injustice, but also needed to stay safe from COVID. The compounding crises created moral dilemmas with no clear answers. Token, now Tolkien, confronts Stan about his privilege and the police violence against black people. Stan doesn't understand why Tolkien is angry at him specifically. Tolkien explains that it's not about Stan personally. It's about systemic racism and the pain of watching society treat black lives as disposable. Stan's inability to understand immediately becomes part of the problem. This scene captures white liberal confusion during 2020's racial justice protests. Many white people wanted to help but didn't understand what helping meant. They expected gratitude for basic acknowledgement of racism. They got defensive when told their understanding was incomplete. Stan represents well-meaning but ultimately ineffective allyship that places comfort over genuine change. The episode doesn't resolve these tensions because they weren't resolved in reality when this aired. South Park couldn't provide cathartic conclusions to ongoing traumas. Instead, they presented the chaos and confusion honestly, showing how difficult it was to navigate multiple crises simultaneously with incomplete information and high stakes. Randy's guilt about possibly causing the pandemic drives him to drink heavily and spiral into depression. He grows increasingly paranoid that people will discover his role in COVID's origin. His guilt is justified, but also selfish, because he's more worried about being blamed than about the people dying. Randy embodies America's reaction to COVID, acknowledgement of severity mixed with refusal to accept responsibility or make necessary sacrifices. The special ends with South Park students returning to school in plexiglass boxes, having learned nothing and solved nothing. The pandemic continues. The problems persist. Life goes on in this weird, degraded form that nobody chose. This ambiguous ending reflects reality at that moment. Everyone exhausted, nobody victorious, the crisis ongoing without clear end in sight. The pandemic special works because it doesn't pretend to have answers. Most South Park episodes end with someone learning a lesson or the town returning to normal. This special acknowledges that normal is gone and lessons are incomplete. They made comedy about collective trauma while acknowledging their own confusion and fear. The follow-up special, South Park Q Vaccination Special, deals with vaccine distribution and QAnon conspiracy theories. It shows how conspiracy thinking flourished during COVID as people desperately sought explanations for their powerlessness. The special satirizes both pandemic restrictions and the people refusing to follow them, finding both positions understandable and ridiculous simultaneously. These specials represent South Park adapting to real-time crisis. They couldn't wait years to process COVID because the audience needed comedy about what they were experiencing right now. The show provided relief and commentary simultaneously, creating humor that acknowledged pain rather than escaping from it. The specials also show the limits of satire during active trauma. South Park's usual approach of exaggerating reality for comedy doesn't work when reality is already absurd. The show had to find new comedy structures that worked alongside tragedy, rather than pretending tragedy doesn't exist. What makes these specials fascinating is how they'll age. In 10 years, will they capture what COVID felt like, or will they seem dated and insufficient? The pandemic was so overwhelming that any artistic response risks seeming trivial. But South Park chose to respond in real time rather than waiting for safety, and that choice matters regardless of how the work ultimately lands. Now let's move on to the mystery of Kenny's family and the cycle of poverty. Kenny's parents are alcoholics who belong to a Cthulhu death cult. They fight constantly, can't afford food, and had so many kids because they're Catholic and can't use birth control. Kenny lives in this hell, knowing he'll probably die before the day ends and wake up to do it all over again. That's not a sitcom setup, that's generational trauma. The McCormick family represents the show's most sustained exploration of poverty and its consequence. They're the poorest family in South Park by a significant margin. They live in a run-down house that barely provides shelter. They struggle to afford basic necessities, and this poverty isn't played purely for comedy. The show treats the McCormick situation as genuinely tragic while still mining it for humor. Stuart and Carol McCormick fight constantly, usually about money or alcohol or both. Their arguments turn violent regularly. They throw things, scream at each other, and create an environment of chaos that their children witness daily. Kenny and his siblings, Karen and Kevin, grow up in this war zone masquerading as a home. The poverty is visible in every detail. Kenny wears the same orange parka every day because it's all he has. The family eats expired food and government cheese. They can't afford heating, so they're always cold. Medical care is non-existent. The McCormicks survive day to day without any buffer against disaster. One unexpected expense means catastrophic consequences. What makes this portrayal complicated is how the show handles Stuart and Carol. They're not entirely sympathetic. Stuart is an alcoholic who makes terrible decisions. Carol enables his behavior and shares his addictions. They're objectively bad parents who've created an unstable environment for their children, but they're also trapped by circumstances beyond their control in many ways. The McCormicks work, but they're stuck in low-wage jobs that don't pay enough to escape poverty. They can't afford education or training for better work. They can't save money because they're always one crisis away from ruin. They're Catholic, so birth control is forbidden, which means they keep having children they can't afford to raise properly. The systemic factors trapping them are real, even if their personal choices make things worse. Kenny's role in this family is heartbreaking. He's parentified, meaning he takes on adult responsibilities that should belong to his parents. He cares for his younger sister Karen. He tries to maintain some stability when his parents are fighting or drunk. He sacrifices his own needs to help his family survive. This robs him of childhood while forcing him to develop adult coping mechanisms before he's emotionally ready. In The Poor Kid, Karen gets taken away by Child Protective Services. Kenny fights desperately to stay with his sister because he knows she needs him. The foster system separates them and places Karen with an aggressively religious couple who treat her terribly. Kenny's worst fear is realized. The system that's supposed to protect vulnerable children makes their situation worse while claiming to help. The foster parents in this episode are portrayed as abusers, hiding behind religious rhetoric. They force Karen to pray constantly and punish her for minor infractions. They're more interested in demonstrating their Christian charity than actually caring for the child they're fostering. This satirizes how foster care systems often fail the children they're meant to protect. Kenny tries to get himself into the same foster home so he can protect Karen. He gets arrested deliberately, hoping to be placed with his sister, but the system doesn't work that way. The bureaucracy is too inflexible to account for the specific needs of individual children. Kenny's agency is meaningless against institutional indifference. The episode ends with Kenny and Karen reunited with their parents. The McCormicks are still poor and dysfunctional, but at least the kids are together. The show presents this as the best available option, which is deeply sad. Returning to a chaotic home with alcoholic parents is better than being separated in the foster system. Neither option is good. The kids just have to choose which bad option is least damaging. Stuart and Carol's cult membership adds another layer of dysfunction to the family. They worship Cthulhu and attend regular meetings where they participate in rituals that curse their son with immortality. But they can't or won't leave the cult, even knowing what it's done to Kenny. This suggests the cult provides something they can't find elsewhere: community, purpose, or escape from their crushing poverty and hopelessness. The cult membership can be read as metaphor for how poverty traps people in bad decisions. Stuart and Carol know the cult is harmful, but they keep going because the alternative is confronting their failures without the structure and community the cult provides. They've invested so much into this belief system that admitting it's wrong would mean accepting they've wasted years of their lives and condemned their son for nothing. Kenny inherits his parents' poverty with no apparent path to escape. He'll probably end up in low-wage work like them. He'll probably struggle with addiction like them. He'll probably raise children in poverty like them. The cycle repeats because the systemic factors causing poverty don't change. Individual effort and good intentions aren't enough to overcome structural inequality. But Kenny also inherits some positive traits from his family. The McCormicks stick together despite everything. They're loyal to each other even when that loyalty is destructive. Kenny learns to value family and protect vulnerable people, which shapes his Mysterian identity. He channels his family's dysfunction into heroism by resolving to prevent other kids from experiencing what he's experienced. The show occasionally suggests that Stuart and Carol were different before poverty and addiction consumed them. There are hints of love between them buried under years of stress and trauma. They chose each other once and had dreams for their future. Those dreams died slowly under the weight of financial pressure and repeated failures. What remains is two broken people hurting each other because they don't know any other way to express their pain. Kenny's relationship with his siblings shows the best version of the McCormick family. He loves Karen fiercely and protects her whenever possible. He's patient with Kevin despite Kevin being largely useless. Kenny represents the possibility that goodness can emerge from terrible circumstances. He's been shaped by poverty and neglect, but hasn't become cruel or selfish. He maintains empathy despite having every reason to become bitter. The McCormick family forces the audience to confront uncomfortable truths about poverty. It's not just about lacking money. It's about lacking choices, security, and hope. It's about watching your parents destroy themselves while being powerless to help them. It's about raising yourself because the adults in your life can't function as adults. It's about knowing your future is probably going to look like your present because mobility is a myth when you're this far down. South Park typically avoids sentimentality, but the McCormick poverty storylines are played relatively straight. The show acknowledges that poverty isn't funny, even when you can make jokes about it. Kenny's deaths are funny. His family's financial struggles are tragic. The show distinguishes between supernatural absurdity and realistic deprivation, treating one as comedy and the other as social commentary. The McCormicks represent millions of American families stuck in similar situations. Generational poverty is real. The circumstances that trap the McCormicks trap real people daily. By including this family in a show mostly about middle-class kids, South Park reminds viewers that poverty exists even in stable communities. It's not somewhere else. It's your neighbor whose house you never visit. It's the quiet kid at school who wears the same clothes every day. Now we're approaching the end. Let's move on to final thoughts about South Park's evolution and cultural impact. South Park has been running for over 25 years, which means it's old enough to have a comprehensive legacy. The show that started with crude construction paper animation and fart jokes has become a cultural institution that influences how people process current events. But what does South Park actually mean after all these years? The show's longevity is remarkable given its format. Creating weekly satire about current events should become impossible to sustain after a decade. Topics repeat, cultural targets blur together, the risk of becoming predictable increases with every season. But South Park keeps finding new ways to be relevant because it's never been about the specific targets. It's been about the approach to targeting. South Park's core philosophy can be summarized as radical skepticism toward all authority and ideology. The show trusts nothing and nobody. Liberals get mocked, conservatives get mocked, centrists get mocked for thinking they're above it all. Religious people are wrong, atheists are wrong. Every position contains hypocrisy and deserves ridicule. This both sides-ism frustrates people looking for clear political messages, but it's also what gives the show its edge. The criticism of South Park has always been that mocking everything is the same as caring about nothing. If you make fun of climate activists and climate deniers equally, you're suggesting their positions are equally valid or invalid. This creates a false equivalence where serious issues become flattened into entertainment. South Park has been accused of teaching a generation to be cynical and disengaged because caring about anything makes you vulnerable to mockery. There's truth to this criticism. South Park absolutely encourages skepticism toward passionate belief. The show suggests that taking any position too seriously makes you a target. This can be interpreted as nihilism or careful media literacy depending on your perspective. The show wants viewers to question everything, but questioning everything can become paralysis where you never commit to positions or actions. But South Park has also evolved beyond simple both sides-ism in recent seasons. The show takes clearer positions now than it did in earlier years. They defend vaccines, acknowledge climate change, and criticize obvious con artists. The enlightened centrism of earlier seasons has given way to more definitive stances on issues where evidence clearly supports one position over others. The transition from episodic to serialized storytelling in recent seasons changed how South Park functions. Early seasons could do standalone episodes about random topics. Recent seasons build season-long arcs exploring single themes. This allows deeper examination but reduces flexibility to address breaking news. The trade-off is more ambitious storytelling at the cost of immediate relevance. South Park's influence on comedy is impossible to quantify but clearly massive. The show proved animation could do satire as effectively as live action. It demonstrated that audiences would tolerate crude aesthetics if the writing was sharp. It showed that weekly topical comedy could work if you moved fast enough. Dozens of shows have tried to replicate South Park's formula with varying success. The show's greatest achievement might be creating space for comedy that offends everyone. Before South Park, offensive comedy usually targeted specific groups: racial minorities, women, LGBTQ people. South Park expanded the targets to include literally everyone, which paradoxically made the show more acceptable to mainstream audiences. If everyone's getting mocked equally, nobody can claim special victimhood. This democratic approach to offense changed comedy's boundaries, but this democratic offense also has problems. When you mock oppressed groups and their oppressors equally, you're ignoring power dynamics. Making fun of trans people has different consequences than making fun of politicians. South Park treats all targets as equally valid, which works comedically but fails ethically when real people face real discrimination based on the traits being mocked. The show has inconsistently handled its impact on marginalized communities. Sometimes South Park defends groups facing discrimination. Other times it reinforces harmful stereotypes for laughs. The inconsistency stems from prioritizing comedy over advocacy. The show's obligation is to be funny, not educational or protective, but comedy has consequences regardless of intent. South Park's commentary on pop culture has been remarkably prescient. The show predicted how nostalgia would be weaponized politically. It identified how social media would create performative activism. It understood how conspiracy theories would flourish in information-saturated environments. Episodes that seemed like exaggerated satire when they aired became documentary within years. The show's treatment of the internet and technology evolved alongside the culture. Early episodes treated the internet as a weird novelty. Recent episodes understand the internet as fundamental infrastructure shaping all social interaction. South Park adapted to each technological shift, satirizing MySpace, then Facebook, then Instagram, then whatever comes next. The targets change, but the underlying critique of how technology mediates human connection remains consistent. Cartman's evolution as a character mirrors the show's evolution. Early Cartman was just a bratty kid. He became increasingly sociopathic as the show explored darker comedy. Recent seasons have made him almost sympathetic at times, while maintaining his fundamental awfulness. He's the show's most complex creation and most controversial element. People debate whether he's funny or whether laughing at his behavior normalizes the real beliefs he parodies. The supporting cast has deepened significantly over 25 years. Characters who started as one-note jokes developed into fully realized personalities. Randy went from background dad to de facto protagonist. Butters evolved from generic kid to tragic innocent. The show's willingness to develop minor characters kept the world feeling alive and full of possibilities. South Park's relationship with censorship has defined much of its identity. The show constantly pushes boundaries and fights to show what networks won't allow. The Muhammad controversy in episodes 200 and 201 resulted in permanent censorship that remains in place. Comedy Central bleeped Muhammad's name and image, proving that some speech is too dangerous for even the most permissive networks. South Park made free speech absolutism part of its brand, but even they discovered limits. The show's financial success transformed Parker and Stone from struggling animators to wealthy showrunners with creative control. They built their own studio and production company. They created a Broadway musical. They signed massive streaming deals. South Park's commercial success validated the business model of offensive comedy, proving that audiences would reward boldness with loyalty and money. But success changed what South Park could be. Early seasons had a punk rock aesthetic of not caring about consequences. Current South Park is a multi-million-dollar brand that must protect its value. The show can't be as reckless as it once was because there's too much at stake. The rebels became the establishment, which is exactly the type of irony South Park would normally satirize. The pandemic specials showed South Park trying to maintain relevance during a crisis that demanded different comedy approaches. The specials succeeded by acknowledging their own uncertainty rather than pretending to have answers. This humility was new for South Park, which usually speaks with unearned confidence. The pandemic forced the show to admit it's as confused as everyone else. Looking forward, South Park's future depends on whether it can keep finding new things to say about an increasingly chaotic world. The show has already tackled most major topics multiple times. The challenge is avoiding repetition while maintaining the skeptical voice that made South Park distinctive. Can the show surprise audiences who've been watching for 25 years? The streaming deal with Paramount Plus represents South Park's future format. Instead of weekly episodes, the show produces longer specials that can be more ambitious in scope. This shift acknowledges that weekly satire is harder to sustain when production takes longer than events take to unfold. The specials format allows more developed stories at the cost of immediate cultural response. South Park's legacy will be debated for decades. Did the show make discourse better by encouraging skepticism, or worse by promoting cynicism? Did it expand comedy's boundaries helpfully, or harmfully normalize offense? Did it say important things about American culture, or just profit from mocking that culture without offering solutions? The answer is probably all of these simultaneously. South Park is both brilliant and destructive, insightful and irresponsible, progressive and regressive depending on which episode you're watching. The show contains multitudes and contradictions because it's been running long enough to try everything. Judging South Park requires accepting that it's not one thing. It's dozens of different approaches to comedy and satire, some successful and some failures, all existing under one title. What's undeniable is South Park's impact on television and culture. The show changed what animation could accomplish. It influenced how comedy engages with current events. It created characters and catchphrases that entered the broader culture. Whether you love or hate South Park, you can't deny it mattered. Few shows can claim to have shaped their medium as thoroughly. As South Park continues producing content into its third decade, the question becomes whether relevance can be maintained indefinitely. Every long-running show eventually becomes a parody of itself. The Simpsons proved that success doesn't guarantee quality. South Park has avoided that decline so far by constantly reinventing its format and approach. But eventually, even reinvention becomes predictable. The show's ultimate test will be how it ends. Will Parker and Stone choose a definitive conclusion, or will South Park just fade away when audiences stop caring? Will they try something bold and risk alienating fans, or play it safe and risk irrelevance? The ending, whenever it comes, will shape how we remember everything that came before. South Park lore has proven that even the crudest, most offensive comedy can contain genuine insight about human nature and society. The show's willingness to say things that polite discourse won't permit creates space for uncomfortable truths. Whether those truths justify the offense depends on your values and what you believe comedy's purpose should be. In the end, South Park is a mirror, reflecting whatever you bring to it. If you want politically incorrect comedy that mocks sacred cows, you'll find it. If you want sharp cultural criticism wrapped in absurdity, that's there too. If you want proof that nothing matters and everything's a joke, South Park provides. The show's genius and flaw is offering enough for everyone to find their interpretation while committing fully to nothing. That's the South Park lore. Complicated, contradictory, offensive, insightful, juvenile, sophisticated, meaningless, and meaningful all at once, just like the culture it satirizes.